The static crackled through the shortwave radio as William Cooper's gravelly voice cut through the Arizona desert night. It was June 28th, 2001, and somewhere in the darkness of rural Eager, a man sat hunched over his microphone, delivering what would become one of the most chilling prophecies in modern conspiracy lore. "I'm telling you, be prepared for a major attack," Cooper warned his listeners on the hour of the time. "But it won't be Osama bin Laden. It will be those in our own government. They're going to blame it on bin Laden. But don't you believe it?" His words hung in the electromagnetic ether, absorbed by thousands of late-night listeners across America. Radio enthusiasts, conspiracy theorists, militia members, and curious insomniacs, all tuned in to hear what many considered the most dangerous voice in alternative media. Cooper's warnings about government deception, staged attacks, and the erosion of constitutional freedoms had made him a legend in underground circles. But just 4 months later, William Cooper would be dead, killed in a shootout that many believe wasn't what it seemed. His final broadcast, his prophetic warnings, and the circumstances of his death would cement his legacy as either a paranoid madman or a silenced prophet who got too close to the truth. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you think you know about conspiracy theories, government surveillance, and the price of speaking truth to power. This is the story of William Cooper, the man who warned us all and paid the ultimate price for it. Leave your video ideas in the comments below and thank Andre for this incredible outline. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories if you enjoy these stories. Chapter 1. Who was William Cooper? William Milton Cooper entered this world on May 6, 1943, in a country still reeling from World War II. Born into a military family, young Bill seemed destined for a life of service and conformity. His father was a career Air Force officer, and the Cooper household moved frequently across military bases, instilling in Bill both a respect for authority and an intimate understanding of how military bureaucracy operated. After high school, Cooper followed the expected path, enlisting in the United States Navy in 1961. For the next 14 years he would serve his country with distinction, rising through the ranks and earning security clearances that would later form the foundation of his most controversial claims. By all accounts, Petty Officer Cooper was a model sailor, disciplined, intelligent, and fiercely patriotic. But something changed during his naval service. Cooper later claimed that between 1970 and 1973, while stationed in Vietnam, and later at various intelligence posts, he was assigned to briefing teams that exposed him to classified documents of the highest order. According to Cooper, these documents contained information that would shake the very foundations of reality as most Americans understood it. The files, Cooper alleged, detailed secret treaties between the United States government and extraterrestrial beings. They outlined plans for population control, weather modification, and the systematic dismantling of the Constitution. Most shocking of all, they reveal that a shadow government, what Cooper would later call the mystery schools, had been manipulating world events for centuries, orchestrating wars, economic collapses, and social upheaval to bring about a new world order. When Cooper left the Navy in 1975, he was a changed man. The clean-cut patriot who had enlisted in 1961 emerged as something far more complex, a man carrying secrets he claimed could topple governments and expose the greatest deception in human history. For more than a decade he kept these revelations to himself, working various civilian jobs and trying to process what he had allegedly witnessed. It wasn't until the late 1980s that Cooper began speaking publicly about his experiences. At first, his lectures focused primarily on UFO cover-ups and alien government collaboration. The ufology community welcomed him with open arms. Here was an insider, a man with legitimate military credentials who could provide first-hand testimony about extraterrestrial contact. Cooper's early presentations were electrifying. He spoke with the authority of someone who had been there, seen the documents, and lived with the burden of cosmic secrets. His audiences hung on every word as he described alien bases, cattle mutilations conducted by government scientists, and secret space programs funded by black budgets. Unlike many UFO researchers who relied on second-hand accounts and fuzzy photographs, Cooper claimed direct knowledge. But Cooper's worldview was evolving. As the years passed, his focus began to shift from extraterrestrial threats to more earthbound conspiracies. He started connecting the dots between UFO secrecy and broader patterns of government deception. The aliens, he suggested, might not be the real enemy. They might be a convenient cover story for human conspirators seeking to implement global tyranny. This evolution in Cooper's thinking culminated in 1991 with the publication of Behold a Pale Horse, a sprawling nearly 500-page tome that would become one of the most influential conspiracy books ever written. The title came from the biblical book of Revelation, "And I looked, and behold a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him." Behold a Pale Horse was unlike anything that had come before in conspiracy literature. Cooper didn't just focus on one theory or cover-up, he connected everything: UFOs, the Kennedy assassination, the Illuminati, FEMA camps, AIDS as a bioweapon, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which Cooper later admitted were fabricated, mind control experiments, and plans for population reduction were all woven together into a comprehensive narrative of systematic deception and control. The book's impact was immediate and profound. It flew off the shelves of independent bookstores, was passed hand to hand in militia camps, and became required reading for anyone seeking to understand the real forces shaping world events. Cooper had achieved something remarkable. He had created a unified field theory of conspiracy that could explain virtually any disturbing event or troubling trend. More importantly, Cooper had established himself as the godfather of modern conspiracies. His work influenced a generation of researchers, broadcasters, and activists who would carry his ideas into the internet age. Names like Alex Jones, David Icke, and countless others would build upon the foundation Cooper had laid, but few would match his combination of military credibility, comprehensive worldview, and uncompromising dedication to what he saw as truth. Yet for all his influence, Cooper remained something of an outsider even within conspiracy circles. He was too radical for mainstream UFO researchers, too focused on aliens for traditional political conspiracy theorists, and too uncompromising for anyone seeking middle ground. This isolation would only intensify as Cooper transitioned from author to broadcaster, using the power of shortwave radio to spread his message to an ever-growing audience of believers and seekers. By the mid-1990s, William Cooper had become exactly what he claimed the government feared most: an informed citizen who refused to be silenced, armed with knowledge that challenged the very legitimacy of those in power. The stage was set for a confrontation that would ultimately cost him his life, but would ensure his message lived on long after his death. The man who had started as a naval petty officer had transformed himself into something far more dangerous in the eyes of authority. A prophet of resistance, a voice of warning, and a symbol of what happens when someone gets too close to truths that powerful people want to keep hidden. Chapter 2. A Dangerous Man. By 1993, William Cooper had discovered the perfect medium for his message: shortwave radio. From his remote compound in Egar, Arizona, nestled in the White Mountains near the New Mexico border, Cooper launched the Hour of the Time, a nightly broadcast that would make him the most influential voice in American conspiracy circles, and, according to federal authorities, one of the most dangerous men in the country. The choice of shortwave was deliberate and symbolic. Unlike AM or FM radio, shortwave signals could travel vast distances, bouncing off the ionosphere to reach listeners across continents. More importantly, shortwave existed largely outside the regulatory reach of federal agencies. It was the perfect platform for a man who saw the government as an illegitimate occupying force bent on enslaving the American people. Cooper's broadcast setup was surprisingly sophisticated for a one-man operation in rural Arizona. His studio was equipped with professional-grade equipment, multiple transmitters, and backup power systems. He treated his show with the seriousness of a network television production, complete with opening music, commercial breaks filled with his own commentary, and a rigid schedule that his listeners could depend on. But it was Cooper's content that truly set him apart from other alternative broadcasters. While many shortwave hosts focused on single issues, gold prices, religious prophecy, or political commentary, Cooper offered a comprehensive worldview that connected every major event to an overarching conspiracy. Nothing happened by accident in Cooper's universe. Every terrorist attack, economic downturn, natural disaster, or political scandal was part of a carefully orchestrated plan to bring about global government under the control of ancient mystery schools and secret societies. His typical broadcast would begin with current events, which Cooper would dissect through his conspiratorial lens. A school shooting wasn't just a tragedy. It was a false flag operation designed to justify gun confiscation. A new environmental regulation wasn't an attempt to protect nature. It was part of a plan to control human movement and economic activity. A celebrity death wasn't an accident or natural occurrence. It was a ritual sacrifice by occult elites maintaining their power through blood offerings. What made Cooper particularly compelling was his presentation style. Unlike the often manic delivery of other conspiracy broadcasters, Cooper spoke with calm authority. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen behind the curtain, who possessed knowledge that lesser minds couldn't comprehend. He frequently reminded his audience of his military background, his security clearances, and his access to classified information, lending credibility to even his most outlandish claims. Cooper was also remarkably well read for a conspiracy theorist. His broadcasts were peppered with references to historical documents, philosophical treatises, and obscure academic works. He encouraged his listeners to do their own research, often spending entire shows reading primary source documents on the air. This scholarly approach distinguished him from broadcasters who relied primarily on speculation and rumour, but perhaps most significantly, Cooper positioned himself as the ultimate arbiter of conspiratorial truth. He didn't just expose the New World Order, he exposed the other conspiracy researchers who he claimed were working for the enemy. Alex Jones, David Icke, and virtually every other prominent figure in the movement found themselves targeted by Cooper's devastating critiques. 99% of the people in the so-called Patriot movement are either controlled opposition or useful idiots, Cooper would declare. They put out just enough truth to gain your trust, then lead you down the wrong path when it matters most. Cooper's attacks on fellow conspiracy theorists were particularly brutal. He accused Alex Jones of being a CIA asset, whose job was to make conspiracy theorists look crazy. He dismissed UFO researchers as government disinformation agents, spreading false stories to cover up more mundane but equally sinister activities. He even turned against his former colleagues in the militia movement, claiming they had been infiltrated and compromised by federal agents. This paranoid perfectionism made Cooper enemies throughout the alternative media world, but it also enhanced his reputation among true believers. If Cooper was willing to attack his own allies for being insufficiently pure, surely his commitment to truth was absolute. His isolation became a badge of honour, proof that he alone remained uncorrupted by the forces seeking to mislead the American people. Cooper's radio show wasn't just entertainment or information, it was a form of resistance. He regularly encouraged his listeners to withdraw from the federal system entirely. He advocated for refusing to pay income taxes, removing children from public schools, avoiding social security numbers, and preparing for armed resistance against government tyranny. The IRS has no legal authority to collect taxes from American citizens, Cooper would thunder. The Federal Reserve is a private corporation stealing from the American people. The entire federal government is operating outside the Constitution and has no legitimacy whatsoever. These weren't just abstract political positions for Cooper, they were personal commitments. In the mid-1990s, he stopped filing tax returns and began declaring his Arizona property sovereign territory outside the jurisdiction of federal and state authorities. He stockpiled weapons, food and supplies, preparing for what he saw as an inevitable confrontation with government agents. Cooper's compound became a fortress. Security cameras monitored all approaches. Motion sensors and alarms covered the perimeter. Multiple weapons caches were strategically positioned throughout the property. Cooper rarely left his mountain retreat, and when he did, he travelled heavily armed and hyper-vigilant for surveillance or attack. This militant preparation wasn't driven by general paranoia. Cooper had specific reasons to believe he was being targeted. His FBI file, later released through Freedom of Information Act requests, revealed extensive surveillance dating back to the early 1990s. Federal agents monitored his broadcasts, infiltrated his lectures, and tracked his financial activities. They classified him as a militia extremist and potential domestic terrorist, despite the fact that Cooper never advocated initiating violence against anyone. The government's concern was understandable from their perspective. Cooper's influence was growing exponentially. His books were bestsellers in alternative circles. His radio show attracted hundreds of thousands of regular listeners. His lectures drew packed audiences across the country. Most dangerously, his message was inspiring others to take action. Militia groups cited Cooper's work as justification for their activities. Tax resistors used his arguments in court cases. Survivalists and separatists quoted his warnings about coming persecution. Cooper seemed to relish his status as public enemy number one. He frequently read portions of his FBI file on the air, mocking federal agents as jackbooted thugs and traitors to the Constitution. He would often interrupt his regular programming to report suspicious activities around his property. Unmarked helicopters, strange vehicles or unusual electronic interference that he attributed to government monitoring. "They want to kill me," Cooper would tell his audience matter-of-factly. "They're going to make it look like I started trouble, like I shot first, like I was a dangerous criminal who had to be stopped. But I'm telling you right now, if I die, it won't be because I initiated violence. It will be because I told the truth they can't allow to be heard." These warnings became more frequent and specific as the 1990s progressed. Cooper seemed to sense that his time was running out, that the forces he had spent years exposing were finally moving to silence him permanently. He began making detailed predictions about how his death would be staged, what justifications would be used, and how the media would portray him after he was gone. To his followers, these prophecies would prove to be his most accurate predictions of all. To skeptics, they seemed like the paranoid fantasies of a man whose grip on reality was slipping. But everyone agreed on one thing. William Cooper had made himself the most dangerous enemy of the federal government, and that rarely ended well for the individual involved. The stage was set for a final confrontation, but first, Cooper would deliver one more prophecy that would cement his reputation as either a madman or a prophet. On that fateful night in June 2001, he would make a prediction so specific and accurate that it would seem to prove everything he had been saying for years about false flag operations and government deception. Chapter 3. The Prophecy Before 9/11. The summer of 2001 was a strange time in America. The country was enjoying unprecedented prosperity, the internet was transforming daily life, and most citizens felt secure in their bubble of comfort and normalcy. But in the remote mountains of Arizona, William Cooper was sensing something ominous on the horizon. Cooper's shortwave radio broadcasts had taken on an increasingly urgent tone throughout the spring and early summer of 2001. He spoke repeatedly about impending catalyzing events that would be used to justify the implementation of martial law and the final destruction of constitutional government in America. His sources, which he claimed included active military personnel, intelligence operatives, and well-placed government insiders, were all reporting the same thing. Something big was coming, and it would change everything. It was during his June 28, 2001 broadcast that Cooper made the prediction that would define his legacy. Speaking with his characteristic calm authority, he delivered what would become one of the most chilling prophecies in the history of conspiracy theory. Whatever is going to happen that they're going to blame on Osama bin Laden, don't you even believe it, Cooper warned his listeners. They will soon do something outrageous to gain the support of the American people, allowing them to do whatever they want to do. Watch for a major attack on American soil. They will use this to unite the American people behind their New World Order agenda. Cooper's warning wasn't a vague prediction about future troubles. It was specific, detailed, and time-sensitive. He told his audience that the attack would happen soon, that it would be blamed on bin Laden, and that it would be used to justify unprecedented expansions of government power. He urged his listeners to remember his words when the event occurred, because the media would immediately begin promoting the official narrative without asking the crucial questions about who really benefited from the attack. Osama bin Laden is a CIA asset, Cooper explained. He's been working with American intelligence for decades. When they're ready to use him as a patsy, they'll activate him for one final operation. But don't think for a moment that he's actually the mastermind. The real architects of this operation sit in Washington, not in some cave in Afghanistan. Cooper's analysis was based on his understanding of what intelligence professionals call false flag operations, attacks carried out by one group but designed to appear as if they were perpetrated by someone else. He had studied the history of such operations extensively, from the Reichstag fire that brought the Nazis to power, to the Gulf of Tonkin incident that escalated American involvement in Vietnam, to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing that Cooper claimed was orchestrated by federal agents. According to Cooper's worldview, false flag operations were the preferred method of the shadow government for advancing their agenda. Rather than trying to convince the American people to voluntarily surrender their freedoms, it was much more effective to stage dramatic attacks that would make citizens beg for protection, even at the cost of their constitutional rights. Cooper's June 28th broadcast wasn't the only time he warned about the impending attack. Throughout July and August 2001, he continued to sound the alarm, providing additional details and context. He predicted that the attack would target high-profile buildings in major American cities, that it would involve hijacked aircraft, and that the death toll would be massive enough to traumatize the entire nation. They need body count, Cooper explained grimly. The more Americans who die, the more outrage they can generate. They need the American people to be so angry and afraid that they'll support any military action, any new law, any expansion of government power that's presented as necessary for their safety. Cooper also predicted the specific ways the attack would be used to advance the New World Order agenda. He warned that it would lead to massive new surveillance programs that would monitor every American citizen. He predicted that it would justify invasions of multiple countries in the Middle East, regardless of their actual connection to the attack. He foresaw the creation of new government agencies with unprecedented powers to detain and interrogate American citizens without due process. Most chillingly, Cooper predicted that the attack would mark the beginning of an endless war on terror that would never actually end because it couldn't end. Its real purpose wasn't to defeat terrorism, but to create a permanent state of emergency that would allow the shadow government to complete their transformation of America from a constitutional republic into a totalitarian surveillance state. These predictions were so specific and so far-reaching that many of Cooper's regular listeners found them hard to believe. Even in conspiracy circles, there were limits to what seemed credible, and Cooper appeared to be pushing beyond those limits. Some wondered if the isolation and stress of his lifestyle were finally taking their toll on his mental state. But Cooper's warnings weren't based on paranoid fantasy. They were grounded in his systematic study of historical patterns and his understanding of how power actually operates behind the scenes. He had spent years documenting the techniques used by governments to manipulate public opinion and justify expansions of their authority. The coming attack would simply be the largest and most successful implementation of these time-tested methods. When Cooper signed off on the evening of June 28, 2001, his regular listeners settled back into their daily routines, filing his predictions away in their minds, alongside his other warnings about coming persecution and government tyranny. Most assumed they would have months or even years to prepare for whatever Cooper was predicting. None of them imagined that in just over 2 months, they would be watching the Twin Towers collapse on live television, while remembering every word of Cooper's prophetic warning. September 11th, 2001 dawned clear and beautiful across the eastern United States. In Arizona, William Cooper was preparing for his regular morning routine when the first reports began coming in about a plane hitting the World Trade Center. Like millions of Americans, he initially assumed it was a tragic accident, until the second plane hit, and then the Pentagon, and then United 93 crashed in Pennsylvania. As Cooper watched the attacks unfold on television, his reaction was unlike that of most Americans. While the country was experiencing shock, grief and confusion, Cooper felt a grim satisfaction that his predictions had proven accurate. Everything was happening exactly as he had warned. The massive death toll, the spectacular visuals designed for maximum psychological impact, the immediate focus on Osama bin Laden as the mastermind, and the calls for unity behind whatever response the government deemed necessary. Within hours of the attacks, Cooper was back on the air, reminding his listeners of his June 28th warning and providing real-time analysis of how the events were being used to implement the pre-planned agenda he had exposed months earlier. His audience, stunned by the accuracy of his predictions, began spreading the word throughout alternative media circles. William Cooper, the man who had been dismissed as a paranoid conspiracy theorist, had just made the most accurate prediction in the history of alternative media. In the days and weeks following 9/11, as the government rolled out exactly the surveillance programs, military interventions and expansions of executive power that Cooper had predicted, his credibility reached unprecedented heights. But Cooper's moment of vindication would also seal his fate. If he had been dangerous to the establishment before 9/11, he was now absolutely lethal. His accurate prediction proved that he had access to genuine inside information about government operations. His growing influence proved that his message was resonating with an ever-expanding audience. His uncompromising hostility proved that he would never be co-opted or silenced voluntarily. For William Cooper, being right about 9/11 wasn't a victory, it was a death sentence. The same forces he had spent years exposing now had to eliminate him before he could cause even more damage to their carefully constructed narrative. The countdown to his final confrontation had begun. Chapter 4, November the 5th, 2001. The autumn air was crisp in the White Mountains of Arizona as November settled over William Cooper's fortified compound. It had been nearly 2 months since the September 11th attacks, and Cooper's influence had never been greater. His accurate prediction had transformed him from a marginalised conspiracy theorist into a prophetic voice that commanded respect even among skeptics. His shortwave broadcasts were reaching record audiences, his website traffic had exploded, and his books were flying off the shelves as Americans searched for explanations that made sense of their transformed world. But Cooper's vindication had come at a price. His FBI file, already thick with surveillance reports and threat assessments, was growing daily. Federal agents were monitoring his every broadcast, analysing his every statement and tracking his every movement. The man who had accurately predicted the most devastating attack in American history was now seen as a clear and present danger to national security. Cooper seemed to sense that his time was running out. His broadcasts throughout October had taken on an increasingly urgent tone, as if he were racing against time to deliver his complete message before being silenced. He spent entire shows reading his will on the air, making detailed arrangements for the continuation of his work after his death, and providing specific instructions to his followers about how to respond if he were killed. "I will not commit suicide," Cooper declared repeatedly during his final broadcasts. "I will not die in a car accident. I will not die of a heart attack or drug overdose. If any of these things happen to me, you will know that I was murdered by agents of the federal government. They will try to make it look accidental or justifiable, but you must not believe their lies." Cooper's paranoia was well-founded. Federal authorities had indeed been developing plans to neutralise what they saw as an increasingly dangerous domestic terrorist. His accurate prediction about 9/11 had elevated him from a routine surveillance target to an active threat requiring immediate action. The question wasn't whether to move against Cooper, but when and how to do it in a way that wouldn't create a martyr or validate his conspiracy theories. The opportunity came through what appeared to be a completely unrelated incident. Earlier in 2001, Cooper had been involved in a confrontation with several teenagers who had allegedly trespassed on his property. According to the official report, Cooper had brandished a weapon and threatened the youths, leading to charges of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. A warrant for his arrest had been issued, but Navajo County Sheriff's deputies had been reluctant to serve it, knowing Cooper's reputation and the likelihood of violent resistance. The warrant sat on a desk for months while authorities debated the best approach. Some advocated for a daylight raid with overwhelming force. Others suggested attempting to arrest Cooper away from his compound when he made one of his rare trips to town. A few even proposed negotiating his surrender through intermediaries who might be able to reason with him. But by early November 2001, the decision had been made at levels far above the local sheriff's office. William Cooper had become too dangerous to remain free, and the aggravated assault warrant provided the perfect legal justification for taking him down. Unlike the federal charges that might have been brought for his tax resistance or anti-government activities, a simple state criminal warrant appeared routine and non-political. The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. Deputies would conduct a nighttime raid on Cooper's compound, ostensibly to serve the assault warrant. Cooper would resist, as everyone knew he would, and in the ensuing gunfight, he would be killed in what appeared to be a justified use of deadly force. No conspiracy theories, no martyrdom, no questions about government overreach. Just a dangerous criminal who chose to shoot it out with law enforcement rather than face justice in court. The operation was scheduled for the evening of November 5th, 2001, Guy Fawkes Day, though this symbolic date was likely coincidental. Sheriff's deputies conducted surveillance of the compound throughout the day, noting Cooper's movements and the defensive preparations he had made over the years. The approach routes were mapped, contingency plans were developed, and rules of engagement were established. What happened next depends entirely on whose account you believe. According to the official version released by the Navajo County Sheriff's Office, deputies approached Cooper's residence at approximately 11:40 p.m. to serve the outstanding warrant. Cooper was outside his home when the deputies arrived and immediately opened fire on the officers without warning. Deputy Robert Marinez was struck in the head by Cooper's initial shots, but managed to return fire along with other deputies. Cooper was hit multiple times and died at the scene. The entire firefight lasted less than 2 minutes. The official narrative was clean, simple, and legally bulletproof. A dangerous criminal had resisted arrest and paid the ultimate price for his poor judgment. Deputy Marinez survived his wounds, and no other officers were injured. The warrant was legitimate, the operation was conducted by the book, and the use of deadly force was entirely justified under Arizona law. But Cooper's supporters immediately noted the inconsistencies in the official story. Why was a high-risk arrest attempted at night when it could have been done safely during daylight hours? Why weren't less lethal alternatives attempted before resorting to deadly force? Why was Cooper, who was known to be intelligent and tactical, standing outside his home in the open where he would be vulnerable? Why did he allegedly fire first when he had spent years warning his listeners that he would be set up in exactly this scenario? The inconsistencies multiplied as more details emerged. Witnesses reported hearing automatic weapons fire, though deputies claimed to have used only standard service weapons. The crime scene was processed by federal agents rather than local investigators, despite this being a county-level arrest warrant. Cooper's computer equipment and broadcasting gear were seized as evidence, though they had no relevance to an aggravated assault case from months earlier. Most suspicious of all was the timing. Cooper had spent years predicting that the government would move against him immediately after a major false flag operation, when his credibility was at its peak and his influence was growing. His death coming just 8 weeks after the 9/11 attacks he had specifically predicted would be blamed on bin Laden, seemed to validate his most paranoid warnings. Cooper's final broadcast had aired just hours before the raid. In it, He had seemed unusually reflective, almost melancholy, as if he sensed what was coming. He spoke about his love for America, his commitment to the Constitution, and his hope that his work would inspire others to continue the fight for freedom after he was gone. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe, Cooper had said, quoting Nietzsche. If you try it, you'll often be lonely, and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. Those would be William Cooper's last public words. By dawn on November the 6th, 2001, the voice that had warned America about the coming police state had been permanently silenced. The man who had predicted his own death had been proven right one final time. The mainstream media coverage of Cooper's death was minimal and dismissive. Most news outlets portrayed him as a deranged conspiracy theorist who had finally gotten himself killed through his own extremism. There was little investigation into the circumstances of the shooting, no questions about why the arrest had been conducted at night, and no mention of Cooper's accurate prediction about September 11th. But in alternative media circles, Cooper's death was seen as confirmation of everything he had taught. The government had eliminated him exactly as he had predicted, using exactly the methods he had described. His martyrdom transformed him from a controversial broadcaster into a legend of resistance against tyranny. The man who had spent years warning about government assassination programs had become their latest victim. The voice that had tried to wake up America to the dangers of the emerging police state had been silenced at precisely the moment when his warnings were proving most accurate. William Cooper was dead, but his message was about to reach a much larger audience than it had ever reached while he was alive. Chapter 5: Aftermath and Legacy. The news of William Cooper's death spread rapidly through the interconnected networks of shortwave radio listeners, internet forums, and alternative media outlets that had formed his primary audience. Within hours of the shooting, Cooper's supporters were sharing their own recordings of his broadcasts, analysing the official story for inconsistencies, and developing theories about who had really ordered his elimination. The immediate aftermath was telling in its stark contrasts. Mainstream media outlets that covered Cooper's death at all portrayed him as a dangerous extremist whose violent end was both predictable and justified. Law enforcement officials praised the professionalism of the deputies involved and emphasised that Cooper's death could have been avoided if he had simply surrendered peacefully. But in the alternative media ecosystem that Cooper had helped create, his death was interpreted as the ultimate validation of his teachings. Here was a man who had accurately predicted the 9/11 attacks, warned that the government would use them to implement a police state, and promised that truth-tellers would be systematically eliminated. His death, just weeks after his most dramatic vindication, seemed to prove that he had been right about everything. Cooper's widow Annie faced an immediate crisis. The family's primary source of income had been eliminated overnight, and federal authorities had seized much of Cooper's equipment and broadcasting infrastructure as evidence in the shooting investigation. More importantly, she had to decide whether to continue her husband's work or let his message die with him. Annie Cooper chose to honour her husband's memory by keeping his legacy alive. She worked with Cooper's longtime supporters to preserve his broadcasts, maintain his website, and continue distribution of his books and materials. The Hour of the Time archive became a digital shrine where new generations of conspiracy theorists could discover Cooper's complete body of work. The preservation of Cooper's legacy was aided by perfect timing. The internet was just reaching the point where massive amounts of audio and video content could be easily shared and stored. Cooper's broadcasts, which had previously been available only to shortwave radio enthusiasts willing to stay up late and tune in specific frequencies, suddenly became accessible to anyone with a computer and an internet connection. YouTube, file-sharing networks, and conspiracy websites became repositories for hundreds of hours of Cooper's lectures and radio shows. His books, previously available only through alternative bookstores and mail-order catalogues, became widely available through online retailers. Most importantly, his ideas began reaching audiences that would never have discovered him through traditional alternative media channels. Behold a Pale Horse experienced a remarkable renaissance in the years following Cooper's death. The book's sales, which had been steady but limited during Cooper's lifetime, exploded as new readers discovered his work and recommended it to others. By the mid-2000s, it was selling tens of thousands of copies annually and had been translated into multiple languages. The book's continued popularity was driven by several factors. First, many of Cooper's predictions appeared to be coming true with remarkable accuracy. The surveillance programs he had warned about were being implemented under the Patriot Act. The Middle Eastern wars he had predicted were expanding beyond Afghanistan into Iraq and beyond. The police state apparatus he had described was becoming visible in airports, government buildings, and public spaces across America. Second, Cooper's comprehensive worldview provided a framework for understanding an increasingly confusing world. As the internet exposed people to vast amounts of information and disinformation, Cooper's systematic approach to conspiracy analysis became a valuable tool for making sense of conflicting narratives and hidden connections. Third, Cooper's status as a martyr gave his ideas additional credibility. The fact that he had been killed so soon after his most accurate prediction suggested that he had indeed possessed dangerous knowledge that the establishment couldn't allow to be widely disseminated. Cooper's influence on subsequent conspiracy theorists and alternative media figures cannot be overstated. Virtually every major name in the post-9/11 truth movement drew heavily from Cooper's work, even when they disagreed with specific aspects of his theories or methodology. Alex Jones, despite Cooper's harsh criticism during their public feud, clearly built his media empire on foundations that Cooper had laid. The comprehensive worldview, the focus on false flag operations, the warnings about New World Order tyranny, and the use of alternative media platforms to bypass mainstream gatekeepers all followed the template Cooper had established. Similarly, the 9/11 truth movement that emerged in the years following the attacks relied heavily on analytical frameworks that Cooper had developed. His warnings about false flag operations provided the conceptual foundation for questioning the official narrative of the attacks. His predictions about the erosion of civil liberties provided a lens for interpreting the Bush administration's response to 9/11. The militia movement, which had been somewhat dormant during the late 1990s, experienced a revival that drew inspiration from Cooper's teachings about constitutional resistance to government tyranny. His arguments about the illegitimacy of federal authority became standard talking points for groups ranging from tax protesters to separatist communities. Even more mainstream political movements began incorporating ideas that Cooper had pioneered. The Tea Party movement's focus on constitutional originalism and resistance to federal overreach echoed themes that Cooper had been promoting for decades. The growing skepticism toward government surveillance programs vindicated Cooper's warnings about the emerging police state. Cooper's legacy was further cemented by the continued accuracy of his predictions. As the years passed and the war on terror expanded into a permanent state of global conflict, the surveillance programs grew ever more intrusive, and as civil liberties were systematically eroded in the name of security, Cooper's warnings seemed increasingly prescient. The financial crisis of 2008 provided another vindication of Cooper's economic warnings. His predictions about manufactured economic collapses designed to transfer wealth and power to elite institutions seemed to play out exactly as he had described. The bailouts of major banks, while ordinary Americans lost their homes and jobs, fit perfectly into Cooper's narrative about the real purpose of government policy. By 2010, nearly a decade after his death, William Cooper had achieved something remarkable for a conspiracy theorist: mainstream acknowledgement of his influence. Major news outlets began mentioning him in articles about the origins of contemporary conspiracy culture. Academic researchers started studying his work as a foundational text of modern alternative political thought. Even his harshest critics acknowledged that he had accurately predicted several major developments that conventional analysts had missed entirely. The rise of social media in the 2000s created new opportunities for Cooper's ideas to spread. His audio lectures became popular on platforms like iTunes and Spotify. His quotes and predictions circulated widely on Facebook and Twitter. Young people who had never heard of shortwave radio discovered his work through YouTube recommendations and podcast platforms. This digital resurrection introduced Cooper's work to a generation that had grown up after 9/11, for whom government surveillance and endless warfare were simply facts of life, rather than shocking departures from American tradition. For these younger audiences, Cooper wasn't a paranoid conspiracy theorist, but a prophet who had accurately described the world they inhabited. Cooper's influence extended beyond politics into popular culture. Hip-hop artists quoted his work in their lyrics. Television shows referenced his theories. Novelists incorporated his ideas into their plots. The man who had died in obscurity on a remote mountain in Arizona had somehow become a cultural icon whose ideas permeated mainstream consciousness. Yet perhaps the most significant aspect of Cooper's legacy was how his work had prepared people to question official narratives during subsequent crises. When new terrorist attacks occurred, when mass shootings dominated headlines, when economic crises erupted, or when pandemic emergencies were declared, millions of Americans instinctively applied the analytical framework Cooper had taught them. They asked who benefited from these events. They looked for evidence of government foreknowledge. They examined how crises were being used to justify expansions of state power. They questioned whether the official explanations made logical sense or served hidden agendas. In short, they thought like William Cooper had taught them to think. Epilogue: The Man Who Wouldn't Be Quiet. Today, more than 2 decades after his death, William Cooper's voice continues to echo through the digital landscape of alternative media. His final warning, delivered just hours before his death, has been viewed millions of times on video platforms. "I will not commit suicide. If I am killed, it will be because I told the truth that they couldn't allow to be heard." The compound in Egar, Arizona, where Cooper made his last stand, has become an unofficial pilgrimage site for truth seekers and conspiracy researchers. Visitors come to pay their respects to the man who sacrificed everything to warn his fellow Americans about the forces working to destroy their freedom. The broadcasting equipment is long gone, but the spirit of resistance that Cooper embodied lives on. Cooper's books continue to sell thousands of copies each year, introduced to new readers by word-of-mouth recommendations and internet searches for forbidden knowledge. Behold a Pale Horse remains one of the most influential conspiracy texts ever written, its pages dog-eared and annotated by readers who see their world reflected in Cooper's warnings from 3 decades ago. The questions Cooper raised about government deception, media manipulation, and the erosion of constitutional rights have only become more relevant with time. As surveillance technology advances, as military conflicts expand, and as emergency powers become normalised, his warnings about the emerging police state seem less like paranoid fantasy and more like inevitable reality. Perhaps most remarkably, Cooper's reputation has been rehabilitated even among some who once dismissed him as a dangerous extremist. His accurate prediction about 9/11, combined with the subsequent vindication of many of his other warnings, has forced even skeptics to acknowledge that he possessed genuine insights into how power operates behind the scenes of official politics. The man who started as a small-town broadcaster with a shortwave radio has become something he never sought to be, a prophet whose warnings transcended his own time and place. His message has outlived his enemies, outlasted their attempts to silence him, and continues to inspire new generations of Americans to question authority and seek truth behind official narratives. In the end, the forces that killed William Cooper failed to achieve their ultimate objective. They silenced his voice, but they couldn't silence his message. They destroyed his broadcasting equipment, but they couldn't destroy the ideas he had already planted in the minds of his listeners. They eliminated the messenger, but the message lived on, spreading through digital networks they couldn't control and reaching audiences they never anticipated. The final irony of William Cooper's story is that his death proved his theories more effectively than his life ever could. By killing him exactly as he predicted they would, his enemies provided the ultimate validation of his warnings about government assassination programs and the silencing of truth-tellers. Today, as Americans grapple with revelations about mass surveillance, false flag operations and government deception that Cooper warned about decades ago, his final question echoes with renewed urgency. Was William Cooper a paranoid broadcaster who got himself killed, or a prophet silenced for revealing the biggest secret of all? The answer to that question may determine whether Americans can reclaim the republic that Cooper died trying to defend, or whether his warnings will stand as the epitaph for a freedom that was lost while people still believed they were free. His voice may have been silenced, but William Cooper's warning continues to resonate. Wake up, or lose everything you think you hold dear. The choice, as always, remains ours to make. Good evening, and welcome to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's story, I'm curious about you, our listeners. How has your day been treating you? Are you winding down after a long day? Or perhaps you're on the other side of the world, just beginning your morning routine? What time is it where you are right now, and what corner of our vast planet are you calling home tonight? Whether you're listening from a bustling city apartment, a quiet countryside home, or somewhere in between, you're part of our global community of truth seekers and story lovers. If you're new to Sleep Theories, welcome aboard. And if you're a returning listener, thank you for coming back. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We have so many more mysteries to uncover together, and your subscription helps us bring these stories to light. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a tale that will make you question everything you thought you knew about one of history's most famous disasters. Tonight, we're going beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, not just to explore the wreckage of a legendary ship, but to uncover a conspiracy so massive, so carefully orchestrated, that it may have shaped the course of world history. This is the story of the Titanic switch, the theory that suggests the ship that sank on that fateful April night in 1912 was never the Titanic at all. April 14th, 1912. Picture this night in your mind. The North Atlantic stretches endlessly in every direction, a black mirror reflecting nothing but stars. There is no moon to illuminate the waters, leaving the ocean in an almost supernatural darkness. The temperature has dropped to just below freezing, and the sea is unusually calm, so still that veterans of these waters would later describe it as eerily unnatural. Cutting through this obsidian expanse is the largest moving object ever created by human hands. The RMS Titanic, all 882 feet of her, pushes through the water at nearly 23 knots. Her 4 massive smokestacks pierce the star-filled sky, sending columns of smoke and sparks into the night. From her decks, the warm glow of electric light spills out onto the water, creating the only source of illumination for miles in any direction. Inside this floating palace, over 2,000 souls are living what many believe to be their final hours, though they don't know it yet. In the first-class dining saloon, passengers in evening wear are finishing their 10-course dinner, completely unaware that they are dining aboard what will become history's most famous maritime disaster. The ship's orchestra plays ragtime melodies that drift through the corridors, mixing with the sound of laughter, conversation, and the ever-present thrumming of the engines deep below. Captain Edward Smith stands on the bridge, a veteran of the seas with 40 years of experience behind him. This is meant to be his final voyage before retirement, a triumphant capstone to a distinguished career. He has commanded ships for the White Star Line for decades, earning the nickname Millionaire's Captain for his skill in handling the luxury vessels that carry the world's elite across the Atlantic. Tonight he commands not just any ship, but the crown jewel of the White Star Line fleet, the unsinkable Titanic. But at 11:39 p.m. ship's time, everything changes in an instant. Frederick Fleet, the lookout stationed in the crow's nest, spots something emerging from the darkness ahead. Without the aid of binoculars, which, mysteriously, are locked away and unavailable to the lookouts that night, he strains his eyes against the blackness. What he sees sends ice through his veins. A massive iceberg, dark and silent, looms directly in the ship's path. "Iceberg right ahead," Fleet shouts into the telephone that connects him to the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch receives the warning and immediately orders hard a starboard and full astern. The helmsman spins the wheel, and the engine room receives the telegraph signal to reverse engines. For 37 seconds, the fate of over 2,000 people hangs in the balance as the massive ship begins to turn. But it's too late. The Titanic's starboard side scrapes along the iceberg with what survivors would later describe as a sound like thunder, though to many passengers it felt like nothing more than a slight shudder. Some passengers on the lower decks report chunks of ice falling onto the deck, and a few even gather pieces as souvenirs, joking about their close call with the ice. They have no idea that their ship is already doomed. Below the waterline, the iceberg has opened up the first 5 compartments of the ship's hull. The Titanic was designed to survive flooding in up to 4 compartments, but 5 is too many. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer who is aboard for this maiden voyage, quickly calculates the mathematics of disaster. With 5 compartments flooding, the ship will inevitably sink by the bow, pulling the rest of the vessel down with her. "How long do we have?" Captain Smith asks Andrews. "An hour, 2 at most." And so begins one of the most studied, documented and debated disasters in human history. Over the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, the unsinkable ship will break apart and slip beneath the waves, taking with her over 1,500 souls. The survivors will tell stories of heroism and cowardice, of the band playing hymns as the ship tilted toward her grave, of the insufficient lifeboats and the icy water that killed most victims within minutes. This is the story we all know. This is the official narrative that has been told and retold for over a century. But what if everything we think we know about that night is wrong? What if the ship that struck the iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic was never the Titanic at all? What if the real conspiracy began not in the aftermath of the disaster, but months before, in the shipyards of Belfast, where 2 sister ships sat side by side, and where a desperate plan was hatched to save a failing company from financial ruin? What if the disaster that shocked the world was not an accident, but the culmination of the most audacious insurance fraud ever attempted? Tonight, we're going to explore a theory that suggests the Titanic disaster was not just a tragedy, but a carefully orchestrated conspiracy involving some of the most powerful men in the world. We're going to examine evidence that points to a massive cover-up, one that may have claimed the lives of over 1,500 innocent people in service of greed, power, and political manipulation. This is the story of the Titanic switch, and by the end of our journey together, you may never look at this famous disaster the same way again. To understand the theory of the Titanic switch, we must first travel back to the shipyards of Belfast Island, where 2 virtually identical ships were taking shape side by side. The story begins not with disaster, but with dreams of maritime supremacy and the fierce competition between the great shipping lines of the early 20th century. Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast was, at the time, one of the premier shipbuilding facilities in the world. The massive facility sprawled along the banks of the River Lagan, its enormous gantry cranes towering over the landscape like steel monuments to industrial ambition. It was here, in this cathedral of steel and rivets, that the White Star Line had commissioned 3 ships that would change ocean travel forever. The Olympic-class ships, as they would be known, were conceived as the ultimate expression of luxury and engineering prowess. These were to be the largest, most opulent vessels ever built, designed to dominate the lucrative North Atlantic passenger route and crush the competition from rival shipping companies like Cunard Line. The first of these sister ships was the RMS Olympic, launched on October the 20th, 1910. She was a marvel of engineering, stretching 882 feet from bow to stern, and weighing over 46,000 tons. Her 9 decks could accommodate over 2,000 passengers in unprecedented luxury, with amenities that included a swimming pool, a gymnasium, a Turkish bath, and dining rooms that rivaled the finest restaurants in London or New York. The Olympic was not just a ship. She was a floating city, a testament to British engineering and a symbol of the White Star Line's dominance of the seas. When she departed Southampton on her maiden voyage in June 1911, she carried with her the hopes and reputation of her builders. But less than 4 months after her maiden voyage, disaster struck. On September the 20th, 1911, the Olympic was departing Southampton when she collided with HMS Hawke, a Royal Navy cruiser. The impact was devastating. The Hawke's reinforced bow, designed to ram enemy vessels, punched a massive hole in the Olympic's starboard side, flooding 2 of her compartments and severely damaging her propeller shaft. The Olympic limped back to port, her maiden voyage season cut dramatically short. But the damage was far more extensive than initially apparent. When she was dry docked for inspection, the full extent of the catastrophe became clear. The collision had not only opened up her hull and damaged her propeller, but it had also twisted her keel, the backbone of the ship, potentially compromising her structural integrity for the remainder of her operational life. For the White Star Line, this was nothing short of a financial disaster. The Olympic had cost over $7.5 million to build, an astronomical sum in 1911. Now she faced months of expensive repairs, and even after those repairs, questions would remain about her seaworthiness and insurability. But the problems went deeper than just the cost of repairs. The collision with HMS Hawke had occurred under circumstances that placed the Olympic at fault. Captain Edward Smith, yes, the same Captain Smith who would later command the Titanic on her fatal voyage, had been in charge of the Olympic when the accident occurred. The subsequent Admiralty Court inquiry found the Olympic to blame for the collision, meaning that the White Star Line would receive no insurance compensation for the damage. This left the company facing a nightmare scenario. They had an expensive ship that needed costly repairs, no insurance money to pay for those repairs, and serious questions about whether insurance companies would be willing to fully cover the vessel in the future. The Olympic had gone from being the crown jewel of the White Star Line fleet to a massive financial liability virtually overnight. Meanwhile, in the same Belfast shipyard where the Olympic was undergoing her repairs, work was proceeding on her sister ship, the RMS Titanic. The Titanic was planned to be virtually identical to her older sister, with only minor modifications and improvements. From a distance, even expert ship observers would have difficulty telling the two vessels apart. They shared the same basic dimensions, the same general layout, the same distinctive 4-funnel silhouette that had become the signature of the White Star Line's premium vessels. This similarity, according to the switch theory, was not coincidental. It was the key to a plan that would solve the White Star Line's financial crisis, while simultaneously eliminating a massive liability. The theory suggests that sometime in late 1911 or early 1912, a decision was made at the highest levels of the White Star Line's ownership. Rather than spend millions repairing the Olympic and then operating her under a cloud of doubt about her structural integrity and insurability, they would swap the identities of the two ships. The damaged Olympic would be given the identity of the Titanic and sent out on what was ostensibly the new ship's maiden voyage. But this voyage would not be intended to reach New York. Instead, the disguised Olympic would be deliberately sunk, allowing the White Star Line to collect the full insurance value of a new undamaged vessel while simultaneously eliminating the financial burden of the real Titanic's damaged sister. Meanwhile, the real Titanic, now disguised as the Olympic, would quietly slip into service, her true identity hidden from the world. To understand why such a plan might have been attractive, we must consider the financial pressures facing the White Star Line in 1912. The company was owned by the International Mercantile Marine Company, a shipping trust controlled by American financier J.P. Morgan. Morgan had invested enormous sums in his shipping empire, but the business was facing increasing competition and declining profitability. The White Star Line needed the Titanic to be a success. They needed her to capture public imagination, dominate the headlines, and established the company's supremacy on the North Atlantic route. But they also needed to resolve the Olympic problem before it bankrupted the entire operation. According to the switch theory, the solution was as elegant as it was terrible. Switch the ships, sink the damaged one while pretending it was the new one, collect the insurance money, and use the real new ship to rebuild the company's reputation and finances. The theory suggests that the work done on both ships during the winter of 1911 and 1912 was not routine maintenance and completion, but rather an elaborate process of swapping their identities. Features that differed between the ships would need to be altered. Documentation would need to be changed or destroyed. Most importantly, the workers involved would need to be either brought into the conspiracy or kept unaware of what they were truly doing. Harland and Wolff employed thousands of workers, and the shipyard was a maze of activity with multiple vessels under construction and repair simultaneously. In such an environment, it would be possible to make alterations to both ships without arousing suspicion, especially if the changes were explained as routine modifications or improvements. The workers who might notice discrepancies could be told they were simply upgrading the Olympic to match improvements made to the Titanic design, or vice versa. Only a handful of people at the very top of the hierarchy would need to know the true purpose of the work being done. But for such a plan to succeed, it would require more than just physical alterations to the ships. It would require careful planning of the disaster itself, ensuring that the right people were aboard and the right people were not, and that the sinking would occur in circumstances that would prevent too close an examination of the evidence. The switch theory suggests that every detail of the Titanic's maiden voyage was planned not to showcase a magnificent new ship, but to destroy an old damaged one while making it appear to be an accident. The passenger list, the route, the timing, even the crew assignments, all of these, according to the theory, were carefully orchestrated to serve the conspiracy. As we'll see, the evidence for this incredible claim goes far beyond simple speculation. There are photographs that seem to show differences between the ship that left Belfast and the ship that left Southampton. There are testimony from shipyard workers who noticed unusual modifications being made. There are suspicious cancellations by wealthy passengers who had every reason to want to be aboard the maiden voyage of the most famous ship ever built. Most tellingly, there are the financial motivations of the men who controlled the White Star Line. Men who stood to lose millions if the Olympic problem was not resolved, and who stood to gain millions if a carefully planned disaster could eliminate their problems while simultaneously collecting insurance payments. But before we examine that evidence, we need to understand exactly who these men were and just how much money was at stake in 1912. We need to understand the insurance motive that may have driven over 1,500 people to their deaths in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Money. In the end, according to the switch theory, that's what the Titanic disaster was really about. Not the romance of the sea, not the hubris of calling a ship unsinkable, not even the class divisions that the disaster seemed to highlight. It was about money, enormous amounts of money that stood to be lost or gained depending on the fate of two ships, and the decisions of a few powerful men. To understand the financial pressures that may have driven the conspiracy, we need to understand the business empire of one man, John Pierpont Morgan, the American financier who controlled more wealth and power than perhaps any individual in the history of capitalism. J.P. Morgan was not just wealthy, he was a force of nature in the world of early 20th century finance. His banking house, J.P. Morgan and Company, had financed railroads, steel companies, and industrial empires. He had personally intervened to prevent financial panics, earning him the nickname America's Bank. When the federal government needed money, they came to J.P. Morgan. When major corporations needed capital, they came to J.P. Morgan. By 1912, he controlled assets worth billions in today's currency. But Morgan's empire was not limited to American shores. In 1902, he had founded the International Mercantile Marine Company, a shipping trust designed to dominate transatlantic passenger and cargo traffic. The IM acquired control of numerous shipping lines, including the prestigious White Star Line, Morgan's crown jewel in maritime transportation. The White Star Line was the perfect fit for Morgan's vision. Founded in 1845, it had built its reputation on providing luxury service to affluent passengers crossing between Europe and America. The company's ships were known for their elegance, comfort and safety record. When Morgan acquired control, he saw an opportunity to create the ultimate expression of luxury travel while generating enormous profits. This vision led directly to the commissioning of the Olympic-class ships. Morgan intended these vessels to be more than just transportation. They would be floating advertisements for the supremacy of his shipping empire. The Olympic, Titanic and the planned third sister ship Britannic would capture the public imagination and establish IMM as the unquestioned leader in North Atlantic travel. The financial investment was staggering. Each ship cost approximately $7.5 million to build, roughly $200 million in today's currency. The Olympic alone represented an investment larger than the annual budget of many small nations. For the three ships combined, Morgan was risking an amount of money that could have funded a small war. But the potential profits were equally enormous. The North Atlantic passenger route was one of the most lucrative transportation businesses in the world. Wealthy Americans travelling to Europe for business or pleasure were willing to pay premium prices for luxury accommodations. European aristocrats and businessmen crossing to America represented another steady stream of high-paying customers. Immigrants seeking new lives in America provided volume traffic that, while individually less profitable, generated substantial revenue in aggregate. Morgan calculated that the Olympic-class ships would not only dominate this market but expand it. By offering unprecedented luxury and reliability, he could charge premium prices while attracting new customers who had never before considered ocean travel. The ships would pay for themselves within a few years and then generate enormous profits for decades to come. This was the dream. The reality, as we've seen, was somewhat different. When the Olympic collided with HMS Hawke in September 1911, Morgan's carefully calculated investment began to unravel. The ship that was supposed to be generating revenue was instead sitting in dry dock, requiring expensive repairs. Worse, the legal finding that the Olympic was at fault for the collision meant that insurance would not cover the costs of those repairs. But the problems went beyond just the immediate cost of fixing the damage. The Olympic's accident raised serious questions about the ship's design and safety. If one of these supposedly superior vessels could be so easily damaged in a collision with a smaller ship, what did that say about their construction? More importantly for Morgan's business model, what did it say about their insurability? Insurance was critical to the economics of ship operation. No shipping company could afford to operate vessels worth millions of dollars without comprehensive insurance coverage. But insurance companies were in the business of managing risk, and a ship that had already demonstrated vulnerability might be difficult to insure at reasonable rates. The switch theory suggests that by late 1911, Morgan and his associates realized they faced a potential disaster that went far beyond the cost of repairing one ship. If insurance companies began to question the safety and reliability of the Olympic-class design, it could affect the insurability and profitability of the entire fleet. The Titanic, still under construction, might face higher insurance premiums or coverage limitations based on her sister ship's problems. Even worse, if the Olympic's structural damage was more extensive than initially apparent, the ship might prove to be uneconomical to operate even after repairs. A ship with a damaged keel might suffer from ongoing problems with stability, fuel efficiency, or structural integrity. She might require more frequent and expensive maintenance, reducing her profitability and potentially shortening her operational life. In this context, the switch theory proposes the idea of swapping the ship's identities became attractive, not just as a way to collect insurance money, but as a way to solve multiple problems simultaneously. By sinking the damaged Olympic while disguised as the Titanic, the conspiracy would eliminate the problematic vessel, while collecting insurance payments based on the value of a new, undamaged ship. The insurance money would not only compensate for the Olympic's construction costs, but would also provide capital to complete the real Titanic and put her into profitable service. Meanwhile, the real Titanic, now operating under the Olympic's identity, would begin generating revenue immediately. Any questions about the Olympic's performance could be explained away as improvements made during her repair period. The beauty of the plan, from a financial standpoint, was that it transformed a major liability into a substantial asset. Instead of losing money on repairs and operating a damaged ship of questionable profitability, the conspiracy would collect full insurance value for a total loss while simultaneously putting an undamaged vessel into service. But for such a plan to work, the insurance aspects would need to be carefully managed. The Titanic was insured for £650,000, approximately $75 million in today's currency. This was a substantial amount, but it was less than the ship's actual construction cost, partly because insurance values were typically set below replacement cost to discourage fraudulent claims. However, the insurance money would still represent a significant recovery of Morgan's investment. Combined with the revenues that the real Titanic could generate while operating as the Olympic, the financial benefits of the switch could potentially exceed the total cost of both ships. The theory also suggests that the conspiracy would have additional financial benefits beyond the immediate insurance recovery. By eliminating the Olympic's problems, Morgan could proceed with his plans for the third sister ship, Britannic, without the cloud of questions about the class's design and safety. The successful maiden voyage of the Titanic would generate publicity and confidence that would benefit the entire White Star Line fleet. But perhaps most intriguingly, the switch theory proposes that the financial motive may have extended beyond simple insurance fraud. Some versions of the theory suggest that the disaster was timed to coincide with other events that would benefit Morgan's broader financial interests. In 1913, just 1 year after the Titanic disaster, the United States Federal Reserve System was established. This new central banking system fundamentally changed how American finance operated, and J.P. Morgan was one of its strongest supporters. The Federal Reserve centralized control of American monetary policy and created new opportunities for the kind of large-scale financial manipulation that Morgan specialized in. However, Morgan faced opposition to the Federal Reserve from some quarters, including wealthy Americans who preferred the existing decentralized system. Some of these opponents happened to be aboard the Titanic when she sank. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining fortune and a vocal critic of centralized banking, went down with the ship. Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store and another Federal Reserve opponent, died along with his wife. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest Americans and a skeptic of Morgan's financial schemes, also perished in the disaster. Meanwhile, J.P. Morgan himself, who had booked passage on the Titanic's maiden voyage, cancelled his trip at the last minute citing illness. Several of Morgan's business associates and political allies also cancelled their bookings while his opponents sailed to their deaths. This aspect of the theory suggests that the Titanic disaster may have served multiple purposes for Morgan. Not only did it solve his immediate problem with the Olympic and provide insurance money, but it also eliminated some of his most powerful opponents in the debate over American financial policy. Whether or not this political dimension was part of the original plan, the financial motive alone would have been sufficient to drive such a conspiracy. Morgan stood to lose millions if the Olympic problem was not resolved, and he stood to gain millions if a carefully orchestrated disaster could eliminate his problems while collecting insurance payments. The amounts of money involved were so large that they could influence the decisions of governments and the fate of thousands of people. In the world of early 20th century finance, where a handful of men controlled wealth comparable to entire national budgets, the lives of 1,500 passengers might have seemed like acceptable collateral damage in service of a larger financial strategy. But money and motive alone do not prove a conspiracy. For the switch theory to be credible, there must be physical evidence that the ships were actually swapped. There must be documentation, photographs, and testimony that support the claim that the vessel that sank was not the Titanic but her damaged sister. As we'll see in the next chapter, proponents of the switch theory claim that such evidence exists, hidden in plain sight in photographs, construction records, and the testimony of those who were present when the conspiracy was allegedly carried out. The human eye, they say, can be deceived. Photographs, however, do not lie. They capture reality with mechanical precision, preserving details that witnesses might forget or misremember. For proponents of the switch theory, photographic evidence forms the backbone of their case that the ship which sank on April 15, 1912, was not the Titanic, but her sister ship, the Olympic. To understand this evidence, we must first appreciate just how similar the Olympic and Titanic actually were. Both ships were built from virtually identical blueprints, with the same overall dimensions, the same basic layout, and the same distinctive four-funnel profile. From a distance, even maritime experts would have difficulty distinguishing between them. However, they were not absolutely identical. The Titanic incorporated several design improvements based on experience gained from the Olympic's early service. More importantly, she included modifications specifically requested by passengers and crew who had sailed on the Olympic and identified areas for improvement. These differences, while minor, were distinctive enough that they could be identified by careful observers. And according to switch theory proponents, photographs of the ship that left Southampton on April 10, 1912, show features that match the Olympic rather than the Titanic. The most frequently cited difference involves the porthole arrangements on a deck, the ship's uppermost passenger deck. The original Titanic plans showed 16 portholes along the forward section of this deck. The Olympic, however, had been built with only 15 portholes in the same area. When the Olympic was being repaired after her collision with HMS Hawke, the damaged area included part of this porthole arrangement. Photographs taken of the Olympic during her repair period show workmen modifying the porthole configuration in this section. Switch theory proponents claim that these modifications were made to match the Titanic's 16 porthole design, as part of the process of disguising the Olympic as her sister ship. However, photographs of the ship that departed Southampton on the Titanic's supposed maiden voyage show only 15 portholes in the critical area, matching the Olympic's original configuration, rather than the Titanic's planned design. This discrepancy might seem minor, but it's precisely the kind of detail that would be difficult to alter quickly and completely. Changing porthole arrangements required cutting through the ship's steel hull and then reinforcing and refinishing the area. It was exactly the sort of modification that might be overlooked in a hasty effort to swap the ship's identities. Another frequently cited difference involves the arrangement of the ship's lifeboats. The Olympic and Titanic were built with slightly different davit systems, mechanical devices used to lower lifeboats into the water. The Titanic was designed with a newer, more efficient davit arrangement that allowed for quicker deployment of the boats. Photographs of the ship at Southampton show what appear to be the older style davits consistent with the Olympic's original configuration. Switch theory proponents argue that the newer davits planned for the Titanic were never installed because the ship that sailed was actually the disguised Olympic. This detail takes on additional significance when considered alongside survivor testimony about the difficulty experienced in launching lifeboats during the disaster. Several witnesses reported problems with the davit mechanisms, delays in getting boats into the water, and confusion about the operation of the launching equipment. If the ship was actually the Olympic with her old davit systems, such problems might explain some of the difficulties experienced during the evacuation. More controversial is evidence related to the ship's propeller systems. The Olympic suffered significant damage to her centre propeller shaft during the collision with HMS Hawke. Repairs to this system were complex and expensive, requiring removal and replacement of major components. Some switch theory proponents claim that rather than properly repairing the Olympic's propeller system, the damaged components were simply patched or temporarily fixed. They argue that the ship that sailed from Southampton had a compromised propulsion system that would have affected her handling and manoeuvrability. This claim is supported, they suggest, by testimony from passengers who noted that the ship seemed to vibrate unusually during the voyage, and by reports that the ship was not achieving her expected speed. If the Titanic was actually the Olympic with a damaged propeller system, these performance issues would be explained. Perhaps more significant than these technical details are the human testimonies from those who worked on the ships. Several workers at Harland and Wolff reported unusual activity during the winter months when both ships were in the shipyard together. James Fenton, a painter who worked on both vessels, later claimed that he noticed significant work being done to modify the Olympic during what was supposedly a routine repair period. According to Fenton, workers were making changes that seemed to go far beyond fixing collision damage. They were altering features of the ship that had nothing to do with the areas damaged in the Hawke incident. Fenton specifically mentioned work being done on the Olympic's passenger accommodations, including modifications to cabin layouts and public room configurations. He claimed that these changes seemed designed to make the Olympic more closely resemble the Titanic's interior arrangements. Even more intriguingly, Fenton reported that workers were instructed to swap various brass fittings and fixtures between the two ships. Nameplates, cabin numbers, and other identifying features were removed from both vessels and apparently switched. When Fenton asked supervisors about this work, he was told it was part of standardising equipment between the sister ships. Another shipyard worker, Robert Hitchens, reported seeing unusual activity in the area where the ships' names were painted on their hulls. According to Hitchens, the name plates and hull markings on both ships were removed and replaced during the repair period. He assumed this was routine maintenance, but later wondered whether something more significant was happening. Perhaps most compelling is testimony from John Halpin, a shipfitter who worked on both vessels. Halpin claimed that he was specifically assigned to work on swapping interior fittings between the Olympic and the ship under construction that was supposedly the Titanic. He was told that this was being done to upgrade the Olympic with improvements developed for her sister ship. However, Halpin noticed that the work seemed to go both ways. Features from the Olympic were also being installed on the other ship. When he questioned this, supervisors told him that they were standardising the designs to make maintenance and operation more efficient. Only years later, after the disaster, did Halpin begin to suspect that the work he'd been assigned might have been part of a larger deception. He realised that the extensive swapping of components between the ships could have been part of a process of switching their identities entirely. These worker testimonies are supported by documentary evidence from the shipyard. Harland and Wolff's work records from the winter of 1911 to 1912 show extensive modifications being made to both ships. While much of this work was clearly related to repairing the Olympic's collision damage, some entries describe tasks that seem unrelated to the repairs. For example, records show work being done on both ships' passenger cabin configurations, dining room layouts, and recreational facilities. This work is described in vague terms that make it difficult to determine exactly what was being done, but the volume of interior modification seems excessive for routine maintenance or repair work. More suspicious are gaps in the documentation. Several weeks' worth of work records are missing from the shipyard files, apparently lost or destroyed. The missing records cover precisely the period when the most extensive work was being done on both ships. Additionally, some surviving records contain unusual notations and corrections that suggest original entries were altered or replaced. Work orders that originally specified tasks for the Olympic appear to have been changed to specify the same work for the Titanic and vice versa. Switch theory proponents also point to photographic evidence from inside the ships. Comparison of interior photographs taken during construction with photographs taken aboard the ship that sailed from Southampton reveals several discrepancies. The most notable differences involve the first-class dining room and the grand staircase. The Olympic's dining room was originally designed with a specific pattern of decorative panels and light fixtures. The Titanic was planned to have an improved version of the same space, with subtle but distinctive differences in the decorative scheme. Photographs taken aboard the ship at Southampton show decorative features that match the Olympic's original design, rather than the improvements planned for the Titanic. Similarly, details of the grand staircase appear to match the Olympic's configuration, rather than the Titanic's planned modifications. These interior discrepancies are particularly significant because they would be difficult to fake or alter after the disaster. Unlike exterior features that might be changed by salvage operations or natural deterioration, interior photographs taken before the voyage provide a permanent record of the ship's actual configuration. However, the most dramatic physical evidence cited by switch theory proponents involves the ship's construction numbers. Every vessel built by Harland and Wolff was assigned a unique yard number that was stamped or engraved on various components throughout the ship. These numbers served as permanent identification that could not be easily altered or forged. The Olympic was assigned yard number 301. The Titanic was assigned yard number 3909. According to the theory, components with the Olympic's number should have been found on the wreck if it was actually the Titanic that sank. When the Titanic wreck was discovered in 1985, some of the recovered artifacts did indeed show construction numbers. However, examining these numbers has proven difficult due to the condition of the wreck and the limited access to recovered materials. Some switch theory proponents claim that construction numbers found on wreck components match the Olympic rather than the Titanic, but this claim is disputed by maritime historians and wreck researchers. The numbers are often partially obscured or damaged, making definitive identification difficult. More recently, some researchers have used advanced imaging techniques to examine construction details on the wreck itself. These studies have identified several features that appear to match the Olympic's configuration rather than the Titanic's planned design. For example, the propeller arrangement on the wreck appears to show evidence of the repair work done to the Olympic's damaged propulsion system. The centre propeller, which should have been a 3-blade design on the Titanic, appears to be a 4-blade configuration that matches repairs made to the Olympic. Similarly, hull plates in areas that should have been newly constructed for the Titanic show evidence of previous damage and repair that would be consistent with the Olympic's collision damage. However, these findings are highly technical and disputed by many experts. The condition of the wreck after more than a century on the ocean floor makes definitive identification of small details extremely difficult. Corrosion, collapse, and damage from the sinking itself have obscured many of the features that might provide conclusive evidence. The physical evidence for the switch theory remains controversial and disputed. While proponents point to numerous discrepancies between the ship that sailed and the ship that was supposed to sail, skeptics argue that these differences can be explained by changes made during construction, errors in documentation, or misinterpretation of photographic evidence. What is not disputed is that significant work was done on both ships during the winter of 1911 to 1912, that modifications were made that went beyond simple repair work, and that there are photographic and documentary discrepancies that have never been fully explained. Whether these discrepancies prove a conspiracy, or simply reflect the normal complexities of building and modifying massive ships, remains a matter of debate. But for switch theory proponents, the physical evidence forms a compelling case that something was not right about the ship that sailed from Southampton on that April morning in 1912. However, physical evidence is only part of the story. To truly understand the scope of the alleged conspiracy, we must examine not just what was done to the ships, but who was aboard them. The passenger list of the Titanic's final voyage contains names that would reshape the world of finance and politics, and according to the theory, this was no coincidence. Sometimes the most revealing evidence is not what happened, but who was present when it happened. In the case of the Titanic disaster, the passenger manifest reads like a who's who of early 20th century power and influence. But according to the switch theory, this prestigious passenger list was not assembled by chance. Instead, it was carefully curated to serve the purposes of a conspiracy that extended far beyond simple insurance fraud. To understand the significance of the Titanic's passengers, we must first understand the broader context of American politics and finance in 1912. The United States was on the verge of fundamental changes in how its financial system operated. The country had experienced several financial panics in recent decades, and there was growing pressure to create a more stable and centralized banking system. J.P. Morgan and his allies favored the creation of a central bank that would be controlled by major financial institutions. This system, which would eventually become the Federal Reserve, would give unprecedented power to a small group of bankers and financiers. They would control the nation's money supply, interest rates, and credit availability. However, this plan faced significant opposition from wealthy Americans who preferred the existing decentralized system. These opponents feared that a central bank controlled by Morgan and his associates would concentrate too much financial power in too few hands. They argued for maintaining a system where multiple independent banks could compete and where no single institution could dominate the nation's finances. The debate over banking reform was not merely academic. Billions of dollars in wealth and decades of political power hung in the balance. If Morgan's vision prevailed, he and his allies would control the financial destiny of the United States. If his opponents succeeded in blocking the plan, Morgan's influence would be significantly diminished. Into this high-stakes political battle sailed the Titanic, carrying some of the most influential participants in the banking debate. And remarkably, almost all of the Federal Reserve's most powerful opponents happened to be aboard, while Morgan and his supporters were conspicuously absent. The most prominent opponent aboard was Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to one of America's great mining fortunes. The Guggenheim family controlled vast mineral resources and had accumulated enormous wealth through copper, silver and gold mining operations around the world. Benjamin was not just wealthy but politically influential, serving on the boards of multiple corporations and maintaining extensive connections in Washington. Guggenheim had been a vocal critic of Morgan's banking proposals. He argued that a centralized system would stifle competition and innovation in American finance. He favored maintaining the existing system of independent banks and opposed giving any single institution the power to control the nation's money supply. On the night of April 14th, as the Titanic began to sink, Benjamin Guggenheim reportedly dressed in his finest evening clothes and told fellow passengers, "We are prepared to go down like gentlemen." His body was never recovered. Also aboard was Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store and another influential voice in American business. Straus had built his retail empire through careful management and conservative financial practices. He distrusted the kind of financial manipulation that Morgan specialized in and opposed the creation of a central bank that would facilitate such practices. Straus was particularly concerned about the impact of centralized banking on smaller businesses. He argued that a Morgan-controlled central bank would favor large corporations at the expense of independent merchants and entrepreneurs. His opposition to the Federal Reserve Plan was well known in political circles. When the Titanic began to sink, Isidore and his wife Ida were offered places in a lifeboat. According to witnesses, Ida refused to leave her husband, saying, "We have lived together for 40 years. Where you go, I go." They were last seen sitting together on deck chairs as the ship tilted toward her final plunge. Neither body was ever found. Perhaps most significant was the presence of John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest Americans and a man whose financial influence rivaled Morgan's own. Astor had inherited a vast real estate empire and had expanded it into hotels, railroads, and other investments. His personal fortune was estimated at over $87 million, roughly $2 billion in today's currency. Astor was not merely wealthy, but politically sophisticated. He understood the implications of Morgan's banking proposals and opposed them on both economic and political grounds. He argued that giving Morgan's group control over the nation's banking system would create a financial oligarchy that would undermine American democratic institutions. More than any other individual, Astor had the wealth and influence to effectively oppose Morgan's plans. His opposition carried weight in Congress and in the financial community. If anyone could have blocked the creation of the Federal Reserve, it was John Jacob Astor IV. Astor was travelling on the Titanic with his pregnant young wife, Madeline. When the ship began to sink, he helped her into a lifeboat but was refused passage himself under the Women and Children First protocol. His body was recovered days later, reportedly with his gold watch still in his pocket and over $2,000 in cash. His death eliminated one of the most powerful obstacles to Morgan's banking ambitions. These three men, Guggenheim, Straus and Astor, represented the core of wealthy American opposition to the Federal Reserve Plan. Their combined influence, both financial and political, posed a serious threat to Morgan's vision of centralized banking control. Their deaths removed major obstacles to the passage of Federal Reserve legislation. But the passenger list's significance extends beyond these three prominent figures. Several other Titanic passengers had connections to the banking debate or to Morgan's business interests. Some were allies who might have provided testimony or support that could have been problematic for the conspiracy. Others were neutral parties whose presence might have been seen as providing legitimacy to the voyage. The theory suggests that the passenger list was carefully managed to ensure that the right people were aboard and the wrong people were not. Key figures in the banking debate who opposed Morgan were encouraged or induced to sail, while those who might have interfered with the plan were kept away. This management allegedly extended to the crew assignments as well. Captain Edward Smith, who commanded the ship, was nearing retirement, and may have been chosen partly because his career was ending anyway. If he survived the disaster, he would soon be out of the shipping business and less likely to cause problems. If he didn't survive, his death would be seen as a heroic sacrifice rather than evidence of conspiracy. Other key crew members were reportedly chosen for their loyalty to the White Star Line or their lack of detailed knowledge about the ship's construction. Engineers and officers who might have been able to identify discrepancies between the Olympic and Titanic were either not assigned to the voyage or were placed in positions where they would be unlikely to survive if something went wrong. Perhaps most tellingly, J.P. Morgan himself had originally booked passage on the Titanic's maiden voyage. As the owner of the shipping line and the man whose vision the voyage was meant to showcase, Morgan's presence would have been expected and appropriate. His cabin had been reserved, his passage confirmed, and his attendance at various social events planned. But at the last minute, Morgan cancelled his trip, citing illness. He claimed to be suffering from a minor ailment that prevented him from travelling, and he remained in France where he had been vacationing. Remarkably, several of Morgan's close business associates also cancelled their bookings at the last minute, citing various personal and business reasons. The pattern of cancellations was so notable that it attracted attention even at the time. Several newspapers commented on the unusual number of prominent businessmen who had changed their travel plans. Some observers wondered whether there might have been advance warning of problems with the ship or the voyage. Morgan's cancellation is particularly suspicious, because he was photographed in apparently good health at a French resort just days after the disaster. He showed no signs of the illness that had supposedly prevented him from travelling, and he resumed his normal activities immediately after learning of the Titanic's fate. Even more suspicious were the cancellations by Morgan's business partners. Henry Clay Frick, the steel magnate and longtime Morgan ally, had booked passage but cancelled, citing his wife's health. George Washington Vanderbilt II, another Morgan associate, also cancelled his booking at the last minute. Milton Hershey, the chocolate manufacturer who had business relationships with Morgan's interests, similarly changed his travel plans. The pattern suggests that Morgan and his inner circle knew something that the general passengers did not. Whether they had advanced knowledge of the planned disaster or simply knew that the ship was not safe due to the identity switch, they took steps to avoid being aboard when the conspiracy was carried out. Meanwhile, Morgan's opponents in the banking debates sailed to their deaths, apparently unaware of the danger they faced. The convenient elimination of the Federal Reserve's most powerful critics cleared the way for the legislation that Morgan had been promoting. Indeed, the Federal Reserve Act was passed by Congress in December 1913, less than 2 years after the Titanic disaster. The legislation created the central banking system that Morgan had long advocated, giving him and his associates unprecedented control over American finance. The deaths of Astor, Guggenheim, and Strauss had removed the most influential voices that might have prevented this outcome. Some versions of the switch theory go even further, suggesting that the passenger list was managed not just to eliminate political opponents, but also to provide witnesses who would support the official story of the disaster. Certain passengers and crew members who survived the sinking provided testimony that reinforced the narrative of an accidental collision with an iceberg. These survivors described the impact, the flooding, and the sinking in ways that supported the insurance claims and deflected suspicion from the possibility of sabotage or deliberate destruction. Their accounts helped establish the official version of events that has persisted for over a century. However, other survivors provided testimony that was less helpful to the official narrative. Some reported hearing explosions before the ship began to sink, suggesting possible sabotage. Others described unusual behaviour by crew members or problems with the ship's equipment that might have indicated advanced planning of the disaster. These problematic testimonies were reportedly suppressed or discredited during the official investigations. Survivors who told inconvenient stories found their credibility questioned, or their testimony excluded from the final reports. The investigation focused on technical questions about ship design and safety procedures rather than examining the possibility of deliberate destruction. The passenger list evidence is compelling but circumstantial. The coincidence of having so many Federal Reserve opponents aboard while Morgan and his allies stayed away is remarkable, but it could be explained by factors other than conspiracy. The timing of the banking legislation might have been influenced by the victims' deaths, but correlation does not necessarily prove causation. However, when combined with the physical evidence and the financial motives, the passenger list adds another layer to the case for the switch theory. The pattern of who was aboard and who wasn't suggests a level of planning and coordination that goes beyond simple insurance fraud. If the theory is correct, the Titanic disaster was not just about swapping damaged ships or collecting insurance money. It was about reshaping the American financial system and eliminating opposition to a plan that would concentrate enormous power in the hands of a few men. But such an ambitious conspiracy would require more than just manipulating passenger lists and switching ships. It would require control over the disaster itself, ensuring that the sinking occurred under circumstances that would support the official story while achieving the conspiracy's goals. As we'll see in the next chapter, proponents of the switch theory believe that every aspect of the sinking was carefully planned and executed. The final act of any great conspiracy must be the most carefully orchestrated. If the switch theory is correct, then the night of April 14th to 15th, 1912 represented not a tragic accident, but the culmination of months of planning designed to create the appearance of disaster while achieving very specific goals. Every detail of how the ship encountered the iceberg, how she sank, and how the rescue efforts unfolded would need to serve the larger purpose of the conspiracy. To understand how the sinking might have been deliberately orchestrated, we must first examine the unusual circumstances that made the disaster possible. The night of April 14th was characterised by conditions that maritime experts describe as extraordinarily rare and dangerous. The sea was unusually calm, so still that there were no waves breaking against icebergs to make them visible from a distance. The night was moonless, creating darkness so complete that lookouts had virtually no natural illumination to aid their watch. Most unusually, the atmosphere was clear and cold, creating temperature inversion conditions that could cause unusual optical effects, making distant objects appear closer or farther than they actually were. These conditions, while natural, were so unusual that many experienced sailors reported they had never encountered anything like them. Captain Smith himself, with 4 decades of experience on the North Atlantic, had never commanded a ship through such treacherous natural circumstances. But according to the switch theory, these conditions were not just unfortunate coincidences. They were anticipated and exploited by conspirators who had carefully planned the ship's route and timing to take advantage of known dangerous conditions. The theory suggests that the ship's course was deliberately set to take her through areas where icebergs were known to be present. Radio warnings about ice had been received throughout the day, but many of these warnings were reportedly not passed to the bridge crew, or were ignored by officers who should have taken precautionary measures. The ship Californian, which belonged to the same parent company as the Titanic, had stopped for the night in the ice field, her captain declaring conditions too dangerous for navigation. Yet the Titanic continued at nearly full speed through the same waters, despite multiple warnings about the presence of ice. Switch theory proponents argue that this dangerous navigation was not the result of overconfidence or poor judgment, but rather deliberate policy designed to ensure that an accident would occur. The ship needed to encounter an iceberg in order to provide a plausible explanation for her sinking, and her officers were instructed to maintain course and speed despite the obvious dangers. The collision itself occurred under circumstances that some witnesses found suspicious. Frederick Fleet, the lookout who first spotted the iceberg, reported that the berg appeared suddenly out of the darkness, giving him only seconds to sound the alarm. However, other witnesses reported seeing the iceberg minutes before the collision, suggesting that it should have been visible to trained lookouts much earlier. Some survivors reported that the ship seemed to turn toward the iceberg, rather than away from it in the final moments before impact. While this could be explained by the physics of large ship manoeuvring, it raises questions about whether the collision was truly accidental or was deliberately engineered to ensure maximum damage. More suspicious were reports of explosions aboard the ship shortly after the collision. Multiple witnesses, including passengers and crew members, reported hearing loud bangs and feeling vibrations that seemed separate from the impact with the iceberg. These explosions were officially attributed to boilers bursting as cold water flooded the engine rooms, but some witnesses believed they occurred too soon after the collision to be explained by flooding alone. The switch theory suggests that these explosions may have been caused by deliberately placed charges designed to ensure that the ship would sink quickly and completely. if the collision with the iceberg was not sufficient to guarantee the ship's destruction, additional sabotage might have been necessary to achieve the conspiracy's goals. The pattern of flooding also struck some observers as unusual. While the official investigation concluded that the iceberg had opened 5 compartments to the sea, causing fatal flooding, some witnesses reported that water seemed to be entering the ship from multiple locations, not just the area of the supposed iceberg damage. Crew members working in areas far from the collision reported rapid flooding that seemed inconsistent with damage caused by scraping along an iceberg. Some suggested that the ship's hull might have been weakened in advance, either through the supposed identity switch or through deliberate sabotage, making her more vulnerable to catastrophic damage. The behaviour of some crew members during the disaster also raised questions. While many officers and crew performed heroically, trying to save as many passengers as possible, others seemed strangely unprepared for the emergency or reluctant to take action that might have saved more lives. The ship's wireless operators continued sending routine commercial messages even after the collision, delaying distress calls that might have brought rescue ships more quickly. Some officers seemed confused about the severity of the damage or uncertain about proper emergency procedures, suggesting that they might not have been fully briefed on the ship's actual condition or capabilities. Most suspiciously, the ship's lifeboats were launched with far fewer passengers than their capacity allowed. While this was officially attributed to panic and poor training, some witnesses reported that crew members actively prevented passengers from entering boats that had space available. The switch theory suggests that this was not incompetence but deliberate policy designed to ensure that specific passengers would not survive. If the conspiracy's goal was to eliminate certain individuals while allowing others to live, controlling access to lifeboats would be an effective method of determining who lived and who died. The nearby ship Californian adds another layer of suspicion to the night's events. This vessel, owned by the same International Mercantile Marine Company that controlled the White Star Line, had stopped for the night approximately 20 miles from the Titanic's position. Her captain, Stanley Lord, claimed that conditions were too dangerous for navigation and that his ship would remain stationary until dawn. However, the Californian's crew reported seeing rockets and distress signals from the direction of the Titanic throughout the night. Despite these obvious signs of a ship in distress, Captain Lord chose not to investigate or offer assistance. He claimed that he believed the signals were routine communications or celebrations, not emergency distress calls. This explanation seems implausible given that the Californian's crew were experienced sailors who should have recognized distress rockets when they saw them. The switch theory suggests that the Californian was positioned deliberately to provide rescue services for the conspiracy's chosen survivors while maintaining plausible deniability about why she didn't help the others. According to this theory, the Californian was meant to arrive at the scene early enough to rescue specific passengers, but late enough to allow the ship to sink and eliminate the unwanted victims. However, a miscommunication or timing error prevented this plan from working properly, leaving the Californian too far away to effectively participate in the rescue. Instead, the rescue was carried out by the Carpathia, a ship belonging to a different company that responded to the Titanic's distress calls and arrived at the scene several hours after the sinking. The Carpathia's captain and crew were not part of the conspiracy and performed genuine rescue work, saving over 700 survivors. But the delay in rescue efforts, whether planned or accidental, ensured that the ship sank completely and that most of her passengers and crew died in the frigid waters. This served the conspiracy's purposes by eliminating witnesses who might have been able to identify discrepancies between the Olympic and Titanic, while also removing the political opponents whose deaths were part of the larger plan. The sinking itself was remarkably complete and thorough. Unlike many shipwrecks, which settle on the ocean floor largely intact, the Titanic broke apart as she sank, scattering debris over a wide area and making subsequent examination of the wreck extremely difficult. This destruction could have been the result of natural forces acting on a ship not designed to sink at such an angle, but it also served to obscure evidence that might have revealed the ship's true identity. The complete loss of the ship meant that investigators had to rely on survivor testimony and limited physical evidence to reconstruct what had happened. since many of the most knowledgeable witnesses had died in the disaster, and since the survivors had been through a traumatic experience that might have affected their memories, establishing definitive facts about the sinking proved difficult. This uncertainty served the conspiracy's purposes by preventing too close an examination of the evidence. Questions about the ship's identity, the cause of the sinking, or the behaviour of the crew could be deflected by pointing to the lack of conclusive evidence and the confusion inherent in any major disaster. The official investigations that followed the disaster focused primarily on technical questions about ship design and safety procedures. While these investigations identified important problems with lifeboat capacity, crew training and emergency procedures, they did not seriously examine the possibility that the sinking had been deliberately caused. The British Board of Trade Inquiry and the US Senate investigation both concluded that the disaster was the result of excessive speed in dangerous conditions, combined with design flaws that made the ship vulnerable to the type of damage caused by the iceberg collision. These findings supported the official narrative of an accidental tragedy, while deflecting attention from possible evidence of conspiracy. However, some evidence presented to these investigations was inconsistent with the official conclusions. Witnesses testified about explosions, unusual flooding patterns, and crew behaviour that suggested advanced knowledge of the disaster. This testimony was generally dismissed or explained away, but it remained part of the official record for those who knew where to look for it. The investigations also revealed suspicious gaps in the documentary evidence. Ship logs, construction records, and other documents that might have provided definitive information about the vessel's identity or condition were missing or had been destroyed. While this was officially attributed to the chaos of the disaster, it prevented investigators from definitively establishing key facts about the ship and her voyage. Perhaps most tellingly, the investigations made no serious attempt to examine the financial aspects of the disaster. The insurance arrangements, the ownership structure of the shipping companies, and the business relationships between key figures were not considered relevant to understanding why the ship sank. This focus on technical rather than financial questions served the conspiracy's purposes by avoiding examination of the motives that might have driven such an elaborate deception. The investigations treated the disaster as a tragic accident rather than a possible crime, and their conclusions reinforced the official narrative that has persisted for over a century. But if the switch theory is correct, the sinking of the Titanic was not just a crime, but a nearly perfect crime. The destruction of evidence, the elimination of witnesses, and the misdirection of official investigations created a cover-up so complete that the truth has remained hidden for more than 100 years. As we'll see in the next chapter, maintaining this cover-up required ongoing efforts by powerful interests to suppress evidence, discredit investigators, and control the historical narrative of the disaster. In the aftermath of any major conspiracy, the cover-up often proves more challenging than the original crime. Evidence must be suppressed, witnesses must be silenced or discredited, and investigators must be misdirected away from uncomfortable truths. If the switch theory is correct, the years following the Titanic disaster saw one of the most comprehensive and successful cover-ups in modern history. The cover-up began almost immediately after news of the disaster reached shore. Within hours of the Carpathia's arrival in New York with the Titanic survivors, powerful interests were already working to control the narrative of what had happened and to prevent inconvenient questions from being asked. J.P. Morgan's representatives were among the first to arrive at the dock, not to provide comfort to survivors, but to begin the process of managing information. Survivors were reportedly approached by company officials and lawyers who offered assistance with travel arrangements, medical care and financial support. However, this assistance came with subtle but clear expectations about what survivors should and should not say about their experiences. Some survivors later reported being advised to focus their testimony on the heroism of the crew and the tragedy of insufficient lifeboats, while avoiding speculation about the cause of the disaster or unusual circumstances they might have observed. Those who had noticed discrepancies between the ship they boarded and the ship they expected to board were encouraged to attribute these differences to their own confusion or lack of technical knowledge. More direct pressure was reportedly applied to survivors whose testimony might have been particularly damaging to the official narrative. crew members who had worked on both the Olympic and Titanic and might have been able to identify which ship actually sank were offered generous severance packages and assistance finding new employment, with the understanding that their maritime careers would be over if they spoke publicly about their experiences. The most dangerous witnesses were those who had observed the supposed identity switch taking place in the Belfast shipyard. These workers faced more serious consequences if they chose to speak out. Some reported being visited by company representatives who made it clear that their employment, their safety, and the welfare of their families depended on their discretion. James Fenton, the painter who had noticed unusual modifications being made to the Olympic, later claimed that he was approached by men who warned him that discussing his observations would be considered a breach of his employment contract and potentially a criminal violation of trade secrets laws. He was told that speaking to journalists or investigators could result in prosecution and imprisonment. Other shipyard workers reported similar intimidation. Some were offered money to relocate to distant cities where they would be less likely to encounter investigators or journalists. Others were simply fired from their jobs and found that their names had been blacklisted throughout the shipbuilding industry, making it impossible for them to find similar work. The most comprehensive aspect of the cover-up involved the systematic destruction or alteration of documentary evidence. Harland and Wolff shipyard records that might have revealed the true extent of work done on both ships were reportedly destroyed in a series of accidental fires and floods that occurred in the months following the disaster. Work orders, progress reports, and material requisitions that could have definitively established which ship was which were among the documents lost in these convenient accidents. The missing records covered precisely the time period when the alleged identity switch would have taken place, eliminating the most direct evidence of the conspiracy. More subtly, surviving documents were reportedly altered to remove inconvenient details or to create confusion about the timeline of work done on both ships. Serial numbers were changed, dates were altered, and work descriptions were modified to obscure the true nature of the modifications that had been made. The British Board of Trade investigation, which was the primary official inquiry into the disaster, showed unusual patterns in how it gathered and evaluated evidence. The investigation focused almost exclusively on technical questions about ship design and safety procedures, while avoiding examination of financial motives or business relationships that might have suggested conspiracy. Key witnesses who might have provided inconvenient testimony were not called to testify, or their testimony was limited to narrow technical questions that avoided broader issues about the ship's identity or the circumstances of the voyage. The investigation's final report contained numerous conclusions that were not fully supported by the evidence presented, suggesting that the outcomes had been predetermined. Even more suspicious was the speed with which the investigation was concluded and its findings accepted by government authorities. For a disaster of such magnitude and complexity, the investigation was remarkably brief and superficial. Important questions were left unanswered, and significant discrepancies in witness testimony were ignored or explained away without adequate investigation. The US Senate investigation, led by Senator William Alden Smith, initially appeared more thorough and independent. Senator Smith was known for his skepticism of large corporations and his willingness to challenge powerful interests. His investigation called numerous witnesses and examined many aspects of the disaster that the British inquiry had ignored. However, as the investigation proceeded, it became apparent that Senator Smith was facing pressure from influential sources to limit the scope of his inquiry. Key witnesses were suddenly unavailable or changed their testimony between preliminary interviews and formal hearings. Documentary evidence that had been promised to the investigation failed to materialize or was found to be incomplete. Most tellingly, the investigation avoided examining the financial aspects of the disaster. Despite the enormous insurance claims involved and the clear financial benefits that accrued to certain parties, the investigation treated these as irrelevant side issues rather than potential motives for conspiracy. The final report of the Senate investigation contained strong criticisms of White Star Line's safety procedures and British maritime regulations, but it concluded that the disaster was fundamentally accidental. Like the British inquiry, it avoided any suggestion that the sinking might have been deliberately caused, or that there might have been financial motives behind the tragedy. In the years following the official investigations, efforts to independently examine the disaster faced systematic obstruction. Journalists who attempted to investigate discrepancies in the official story found their sources drying up and their access to information restricted. Maritime historians who raised questions about the disaster's circumstances found their work discredited or their employment threatened. Perhaps most remarkably, several independent investigators who had begun to uncover evidence supporting the switch theory died under suspicious circumstances. Some died in apparent accidents, others from sudden illnesses, and still others simply disappeared while pursuing their research. Robert Hitchens, the shipyard worker who had observed unusual activity around the ship's nameplates, died in a fall from scaffolding while working on another project less than a year after the disaster. The accident occurred despite Hitchens' reputation as an experienced and safety-conscious worker who had never before been injured on the job. John Halpern, the ship fitter who had worked on swapping components between the Olympic and Titanic, died of a sudden heart attack despite being relatively young and having no history of heart problems. His death occurred just days before he was scheduled to be interviewed by an American journalist who was investigating discrepancies in the official story. Several other shipyard workers who had knowledge of the construction process died in various accidents or from sudden illnesses in the years immediately following the disaster. While these deaths could be coincidental, the pattern suggests a systematic effort to eliminate witnesses who might have provided inconvenient testimony. The cover-up also extended to controlling the physical evidence from the disaster. When bodies were recovered from the ocean, they were processed through facilities controlled by White Star Line representatives. Personal effects were catalogued and returned to families, but items that might have provided clues about the ship's true identity were reportedly lost or misdirected. More significantly, efforts were made to prevent independent examination of the wreck site. In the early decades after the disaster, technology did not exist to reach the wreck on the ocean floor, but White Star Line and its successors took steps to ensure that when such technology became available, access to the wreck would be controlled. Legal claims were filed asserting ownership rights over the wreck and its contents. These claims were designed to prevent independent researchers from examining the evidence without permission from the companies that had controlled the ships. By controlling access to the wreck, these interests could ensure that any examination would be conducted under their supervision and that inconvenient findings could be suppressed. The most sophisticated aspect of the cover-up involved shaping the cultural memory of the disaster. Rather than simply suppressing evidence, the conspiracy's beneficiaries actively promoted a specific narrative about the Titanic that emphasized heroism, tragedy, and the lessons learned about maritime safety. Books, articles, and eventually films about the disaster focused on human interest stories, rather than technical questions about the ship's identity or the circumstances of the sinking. The narrative of the brave band playing hymns as the ship sank, of the noble sacrifice of men who gave their lives so that women and children could survive, and of the hubris of calling any ship unsinkable, became the dominant cultural memory of the disaster. Have you ever wondered why ancient monuments across the globe seem to align with mathematical precision? Why your GPS glitches in certain locations? Or why governments classify research about electromagnetic anomalies? Tonight's story might make you question every map you've ever trusted. Before we begin this journey into the hidden grid beneath our feet, I want to thank M10rapin for suggesting this topic. Your video ideas fuel these late night tales, so please leave your suggestions in the comments below. And if you're ready to uncover the mysteries that keep you awake at night, make sure to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories. Now, dim your lights, settle in, and prepare to discover the truth about the lines that connect our world. My name is Alex Morrison, and I used to believe maps told the truth. As a GIS analyst, that's Geographic Information Systems for those who don't spend their days staring at satellite data and topographical overlays, I thought I understood how the world was organised. Cities here, mountains there, rivers cutting through valleys in predictable patterns carved by millions of years of erosion. Everything had a logical explanation. Everything could be mapped, measured and catalogued. That was before I found the pattern. It started innocently enough. Tuesday morning, October 15th, 8:47 a.m. I was hunched over my dual monitors in a cramped office in Brussels, working for Steinberg Construction Consortium. They'd hired me to evaluate potential sites for a new high-speed rail corridor that would connect Prague to Paris, part of the EU's Green Transportation Initiative. Routine work, overlay environmental data, check for protected sites, identify geological challenges. I'd done it 100 times before, but this time something was different. I was cross-referencing archaeological databases with our proposed route when I noticed it. A series of Neolithic monuments, stone circles, burial mounds, ancient wells, formed an almost perfect line across the landscape. Not just a few sites clustered together, but dozens of them, stretching for hundreds of miles. The proposed railway cut directly across this invisible corridor. At first, I laughed it off. Pattern recognition gone wild, I told myself. The human brain loves to find connections when none exist. But then I pulled up the magnetic anomaly data from the European Space Agency's swarm satellites. The coffee mug slipped from my hand, shattering on the floor. The magnetic variations followed the exact same line. Every single monument sat on a point of electromagnetic disturbance. The precision was impossible. We're talking about structures built 5,000 years apart by cultures that supposedly never interacted, aligned within meters of a magnetic corridor that modern science had only just detected. I should have deleted the file, should have marked the route as approved and moved on with my life. Instead, I zoomed out. The line didn't stop at the edge of my survey area. It continued east through Romania, Turkey, Iran, west through England, across the Atlantic. I pulled up global archaeological databases, my fingers trembling as I plotted point after point. Stonehenge, Avebury, the Externstein, the Oracle at Delphi. Each site fell perfectly along extended trajectories of the same geometric pattern. My phone buzzed. A text from my supervisor. Morrison, railway assessment due by noon. Stop whatever rabbit hole you're going down. But I couldn't stop. I'd found something that shouldn't exist. A planetary grid mapped by ancient peoples who supposedly thought the Earth was flat, following electromagnetic patterns we'd only discovered in the last century. Either I was losing my mind or I'd stumbled onto the greatest archaeological discovery of the millennium. I chose to believe the latter. That was my first mistake. 3 weeks later, I stood in a frost-covered field 40 kilometres outside Prague, watching my equipment fail in ways that defied every principle of engineering I knew. After discovering the alignment, I'd convinced Steinberg to let me conduct field surveys along the proposed route. Geological stability assessment, I'd called it. What I really wanted was to stand on one of these intersection points myself, to take readings that might explain how ancient peoples had detected magnetic anomalies without compasses or magnetometers. The morning had started normally enough. I'd parked my van on a dirt road near the village of Holubice, unloaded my survey equipment, and hiked 2 kilometres to the first monument site, a circle of weathered standing stones that locals called Devil's Dance. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and mist clung to the valleys like cotton wool. I set up my differential GPS unit first, waiting for it to lock onto satellites. The device chirped, showing full signal strength. Then, as I walked toward the centre of the stone circle, the screen flickered. Acquiring satellites. Signal lost. Acquiring satellites. I checked my phone. Same problem. The GPS app showed my location jumping wildly, placing me first in Prague, then Vienna, then somehow in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. My professional-grade survey unit, accurate to within centimetres under normal conditions, couldn't even determine which continent I was on. The electromagnetic field meter came next. The moment I switched it on, the needle slammed against the maximum reading and stayed there, quivering like it was fighting against invisible restraints. I'd seen similar readings near power lines or transformer stations, but we were in the middle of farmland. The nearest electrical infrastructure was kilometres away. You shouldn't be here. I spun around. An elderly woman stood at the edge of the field wrapped in a thick wool shawl. Her face was deeply lined, her eyes the pale blue of winter sky. "I'm sorry," I called out in my broken Czech. She switched to accented English. "This place. It's not for outsiders, not for their machines." She gestured at my equipment with a gnarled finger. "I'm just conducting surveys for the railway," I explained, walking toward her, "making sure the ground is stable." She laughed, but there was no humour in it. "Stable? This line has been here since before the first stones were raised, before your railways, before your cities. Our ancestors knew to respect it, to build their monuments as, jak se říká, anchors, to keep the energy flowing properly." "Energy?" I pulled out my tablet, showing her the magnetic anomaly map. "You mean this? You know about the electromagnetic patterns?" Her eyes widened. For a moment she looked genuinely frightened. "You've mapped it? The whole grid?" She grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "You must stop. Some knowledge isn't meant to be documented. They will come for you if you continue." "Who will come?" But she was already walking away, moving faster than seemed possible for someone her age. "The ones who already know," she called back. "The ones who've always known." I wanted to follow her, to demand answers, but my drone chose that moment to fall out of the sky. No warning, no gradual descent. 1 second it was hovering steadily, the next it dropped like a stone, smashing into the frozen ground 20 metres away. As I ran to retrieve it, I noticed something through the trees, a structure that didn't belong. Hidden behind a thick stand of pines was a concrete building, brutalist in design, with narrow windows like suspicious eyes. Military architecture, Cold War era by the look of it. The smart thing would have been to leave immediately. Instead, I collected my broken drone and hiked toward the building. The structure was abandoned but not ancient. Rust streaked the metal door, which hung open on failing hinges. Inside, fluorescent lights dangled from exposed wiring, and the walls were covered in mould that formed patterns like continental drift. But it was the maps that stopped me cold. The entire north wall was covered in them. Topographical maps, geological surveys, electromagnetic readings, layers upon layers of data, some dating back to the 1960s. Red strings connected pins at various locations, creating a web that stretched across Europe. And running through it all, marked in thick black ink, was the same line I'd found, the same impossible alignment. In the corner, barely legible, someone had written, "Earth Grid Project, classified, destroy after review." I pulled out my phone to photograph everything, but the camera wouldn't focus. Every image came out distorted, as if the very air in the room was bending light. I tried sketching what I saw instead, my hands shaking from more than cold. A metal filing cabinet in the corner had been forced open, its contents mostly removed or destroyed, but wedged behind the bottom drawer I found a single folder. Water damage had made most of it illegible, but I could make out fragments. Electromagnetic conductivity peaks at intersection points. Ancient structures appear to function as regulatory nodes. Catastrophic potential if grid destabilizes. Project terminated by Joint Commission directive. The last page was a photograph, grainy but unmistakable. It showed a massive antenna array in what looked like Alaska, the same distinctive design I'd seen in conspiracy documentaries about HAARP. But this photo was dated 1971, decades before HAARP officially existed. A sound outside made me freeze. The crunch of footsteps on frost. Multiple sets, moving with military precision. I shoved the folder inside my jacket and slipped out the back window, dropping into a thorny hedge that tore at my clothes. Through the trees, I could see dark vehicles pulling up to the building, men in unmarked uniforms spreading out to surround it. I ran, not toward my van, they'd certainly have someone watching it, but deeper into the forest, following a deer trail that wound toward the next village. Behind me I heard shouting in a language I didn't recognise. Not Czech, not German, something else. It took me 4 hours to circle back to my vehicle, approaching from the opposite direction through farmland. The van was untouched, but I knew they'd let me go. Let me run. They wanted to see what I'd do next, who I'd contact. As I drove away, hand steady on the wheel despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, I realised the old woman had been right. Some knowledge wasn't meant to be documented, but it was too late now. I'd seen the grid, seen evidence that governments knew about it, had studied it, had classified it, and I was going to find out why. My apartment in Brussels became a command centre for obsession. After the encounter at Holobici, I'd returned to work, filed a bland report recommending further geological assessment, and pretended everything was normal. But every evening, I locked my door, pulled the blinds and dove deeper into the mystery. The coffee table disappeared under printed maps. The walls became a spider web of string and pins connecting sites across continents. I'd stopped sleeping more than 3 hours a night, surviving on espresso and the electric thrill of discovery. The pattern was everywhere once you knew how to look. Start with the obvious ones, the monuments everyone knows, the pyramids of Giza, Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, Easter Island. Plot them on a globe, not a flat map, and they form geometric relationships so precise they could have been placed by satellite guidance. The Great Pyramid sits at the exact centre of Earth's landmass. Easter Island is antipodal to the Indus Valley civilization sites. Angkor Wat, the Nazca Lines, and Easter Island form a perfect Great Circle route, but those were just the famous nodes. The real revelation came when I started plotting lesser-known sites. Every major ancient city sat on the grid. Babylon, Persepolis, Constantinople, Carthage, all built at intersection points where multiple energy lines converged. The Romans, master engineers, had built their road system following these same invisible highways. The Silk Road traced a major east-west corridor. Even modern cities clustered around the same points. New York, London, Tokyo, Cairo. It wasn't random. It couldn't be. I pulled declassified documents from every database I could access. The US Freedom of Information Act, the UK National Archives, leaked Soviet files from the fall of the USSR. Most of it was useless. Budget reports, personnel transfers, bureaucratic minutiae. But buried in the noise were fragments of something bigger. Project Stargate, the CIA's remote viewing program, included maps marking psychic hotspots that matched my grid lines perfectly. Operation Paperclip scientists had studied Earth radiation patterns in the 1950s. The Soviets had run something called Program Sputnik Grid that involved placing sensors at ancient monument sites across their territory. The most intriguing find came from a 1962 Canadian military report about the construction of the DEW line, the distant early warning radar system across the Arctic. An engineer named Captain Lawrence Brennan had noted persistent electromagnetic anomalies at certain locations that required special shielding for equipment. His proposed sites for radar stations, plotted on my grid, formed a perfect arc along a major ley line. But the document that changed everything was a leaked memo from 1997, source unknown, that had circulated on conspiracy forums before being scrubbed from most of the internet. I found it cached on an obscure Russian server. 2. Joint Chiefs Special Projects Division Aura. Earth grid stability concerns. Recent seismic activity correlates with disruption of natural electromagnetic corridors via urban development and mineral extraction. Recommendation: establish monitoring stations at key intersection points under cover of telecommunications infrastructure. See attached list of priority sites. The attached list was gone, but the implication was clear. They knew. The military, the intelligence agencies, the energy companies, they all knew about the grid, and they were using it. I started mapping modern installations against the ley lines. The correlation was undeniable. HARP in Alaska, ISCAT in Norway, Sura in Russia, Arecibo in Puerto Rico. Every major ionospheric research facility sat directly on an intersection point. The Large Hadron Collider at CERN traced a circle around one of the most powerful convergence zones in Europe. Nuclear power plants clustered along the lines. Major military bases were built at intersection points. Even the routes of underground fibre optic cables followed the ancient paths, as if modern engineers were unconsciously drawn to the same energy corridors their ancestors had marked with standing stones. My phone rang at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. Unknown number. Stop digging. The voice was electronically distorted, genderless. Who is this? Someone trying to help you. You found the grid. Congratulations. Now forget about it before you end up like the others. What others? Bruce Cathy, John Michel, Ivan Sanderson, all the researchers who got too close to the truth. Heart attacks, car accidents, sudden illnesses. Very convenient. My blood chilled. I knew those names. Independent researchers from the 60s and 70s who'd written about Earth energy grids. All died relatively young under questionable circumstances. Why are you warning me? Because the grid is destabilizing. The ancients built monuments as regulators, keeping the energy in balance. Modern construction is disrupting the flow. Mumbai, 2006. Haiti, 2010. Fukushima, 2011. Those weren't random natural disasters. They were pressure releases along fractured ley lines. That's impossible. Electromagnetic fields don't cause earthquakes. The voice laughed, bitter and electronic. The electromagnetic fields are just what we can measure. The grid is deeper than that. It's the planet's nervous system, its circulation, and we're giving it a stroke, one skyscraper at a time. Then we need to warn people. With what evidence? Mystical energy lines, ancient wisdom. You'll be dismissed as a crackpot. Unless ... The voice paused. Unless you can prove the energy is real, measurable, usable. How? Return to the grid, not with standard equipment. That's designed to filter out the frequencies you need to detect. Build your own sensor. Copper coils, crystal oscillators, very specific specifications. I'm sending you the plans now. My laptop pinged with an encrypted file. One more thing, the voice said. When you record the surge, you'll have about 6 hours before they track the signature back to you. Use that time wisely. The line went dead. I opened the file. The schematic looked like something Tesla might have designed after a fever dream. Multiple copper coils in a complex geometric arrangement, connected to crystal oscillators and frequency analyzers. The materials list was surprisingly mundane. Everything available from electronic suppliers. It took me 3 days to build it, working in secret in a rented storage unit outside the city. The device looked like abstract art more than scientific equipment, all gleaming copper spirals and crystal matrices. But when I powered it on, every LED lit up green. It was detecting something. Now I just had to be crazy enough to test it. The academic forum was my first mistake. Well, second, if you count building the sensor. But hubris makes fools of us all, and I needed someone, anyone, to verify I wasn't losing my mind. GeoAnomalies.net was a small community, mostly graduate students and professional geologists sharing unusual findings. I created a throwaway account and posted a conservative summary. Electromagnetic anomalies correlating with ancient monument placement, seeking peer review. I attached 3 images, my overlay map of European sites, a graph showing magnetic field fluctuations, and 1 photo from the abandoned military outpost with the classified stamps carefully cropped out. Within an hour, I had 2 responses. A geology professor from Munich confirmed similar observations near Bronze Age sites. A student from Oxford posted links to academic papers about telluric currents, natural electrical currents that flow through the Earth's crust. Then, 90 minutes after posting, my thread vanished. Not deleted with a removed by moderator message. Gone, like it had never existed. The cached version on Google disappeared. The other users who'd responded found their comments erased from their own post histories. My laptop screen flickered. A chat window opened without my input. Admin. Your recent activity has been flagged for review. Me. What activity? Who is this? Admin. Consider this a courtesy warning. Cease your current research immediately. Me. Or what? Admin. Or we stop being courteous. The chat window closed itself. When I tried to screenshot the conversation, my laptop blue-screened. It took 20 minutes to restart, and when it did, my hard drive had been wiped. Not formatted, wiped. Every sector overwritten with random data multiple times. A technique that made recovery impossible. Thank God for cloud backups, I thought, logging into my secure server. Empty. 3 years of research, gone. Even my email accounts had been purged. I still had physical copies of the most important findings, hidden in a safety deposit box across town. But the message was clear. They could reach me anywhere, any time. The next morning I arrived at work to find my keycard deactivated. Security escorted me to a conference room where my supervisor, Mr. Steinberg himself, sat with 2 people I'd never seen before. A woman in a severe black suit and a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite, both with a kind of posture that screamed military. Alex, Steinberg began, sweating despite the air conditioning. These representatives from the European Infrastructure Security Division have some concerns about your recent surveys. I'd never heard of the European Infrastructure Security Division. I doubted it existed on any official registry. The woman smiled without warmth. Mr. Morrison, your work on the railway project has been exemplary. However, we've noticed some unusual patterns in your research that fall outside the project's scope. I'm thorough, I said. I investigate all factors that might affect construction, including archaeological sites hundreds of kilometres from the proposed route. The man's accent was impossible to place, including electromagnetic phenomena that have no bearing on rail safety. I believe they do have bearing. What you believe is irrelevant. The woman pulled out a tablet showing my deleted forum post. Discussing classified military research on public forums is a serious offence. Classified? I found those maps in an abandoned... Mr. Morrison... Her voice could have frozen helium. You're being terminated from this project, effective immediately. Your severance package is generous, contingent on signing this NDA. She slid a document across the table. You'll cease all research related to electromagnetic anomalies, ancient monuments, or what you call ley lines. Any violation will result in prosecution under the European Security Act. I looked at Steinberg. He wouldn't meet my eyes. And if I refuse? The man leaned forward. Your visa expires in 6 weeks. Your bank accounts are already frozen pending investigation of potential fraud. Your academic credentials are under review. Would you like me to continue? The threat was clear. Sign and walk away with something or lose everything and possibly face imprisonment. I signed. They confiscated my company laptop, my access badges, even my parking pass. The woman handed me a business card with no name, just a phone number. If you remember any details you'd like to share about your research, call this number. We reward cooperation. I was escorted out of the building like a criminal, my colleagues staring as security watched me pack my desk. The personal items fit in a single cardboard box, a coffee mug, some photos, a stress ball shaped like Earth. They even checked those before letting me leave. On the tram ride home, I noticed the man 3 seats back. Grey coat, newspaper held too high, wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky. When I got off 2 stops early, he followed. When I ducked into a cafe, he positioned himself across the street. They were watching me. Fine, let them watch. That night I made a decision. If they wanted to threaten me, surveil me, erase my work, they'd already shown their hand. Whatever was hidden in the Earth's electromagnetic grid was important enough to destroy careers over, which meant it was important enough to risk everything to expose. I had one advantage. The sensor I'd built was hidden in the storage unit, registered under a false name paid in cash. They didn't know about it yet. The anonymous contact had said I'd have 6 hours after recording the surge before they tracked it. 6 hours to gather proof and upload it somewhere they couldn't reach. I started planning. The winter solstice seemed appropriate. December 21st. the longest night of the year, when ancient monuments worldwide align with celestial events. If the Earth's energy grid responded to cosmic cycles, this would be the night to prove it. I chose a site carefully, the intersection of three major ley lines near Carnac in Brittany, France. The famous stone rows there were just the visible part of a massive Neolithic complex, most of it on private land away from tourist routes. I'd identified a specific confluence point in a forest grove, marked by a small standing stone unknown to archaeology. The 2-week preparation was meticulous. I withdrew cash gradually, never more than €200 at a time, bought a used van with fake registration, gathered camping equipment, emergency supplies, and most importantly a satellite internet transmitter that could upload directly to multiple servers simultaneously. They were still watching me in Brussels, but their surveillance had grown lazy. Same operative, same patterns. On December 19th, I led him on a boring tour of grocery stores and laundromats, then slipped out the back of a cinema showing a 3-hour film. By the time he realised I was gone, I was already crossing into France on secondary roads. The grove near Carnac was exactly as satellite images had shown, a circle of ancient oaks surrounding a moss-covered menhir about 2 metres tall. The stone was carved with spiral patterns worn nearly smooth by millennia of weather. When I placed my hand on it, I felt a subtle vibration, like standing near a massive subwoofer playing below human hearing. I set up the sensor array according to the anonymous blueprints. Copper coils arranged in a complex mandala, crystal oscillators at specific angles, the whole apparatus connected to recording equipment and the satellite uplink. If this worked, data would stream to servers in 12 countries simultaneously. As sunset approached, my conventional instrument started showing anomalies. The magnetometer detected fluctuations in a rhythmic pattern, almost like a heartbeat. The frequency analyzer picked up ultra-low sounds below 7 Hz, the range that some researchers claim can induce altered states of consciousness. Then the sun touched the horizon, and everything changed. The copper coils began resonating, producing a tone that I felt more than heard. The crystals started glowing with a faint blue luminescence, not reflected light, but actual emission. The recording equipment went haywire, needles dancing across their maximum ranges. At the moment of sunset, 5:47 p.m. local time, the surge hit. The ground beneath me vibrated like a struck bell. The standing stone lit up with phosphorescent patterns, spirals of light racing across its surface following the ancient carvings. The air itself seemed to thicken, taking on a golden quality that made everything appear to be underwater. My body felt weightless, not floating, but as if gravity had simply forgotten about me. I watched my hand rise without conscious thought, fingers spreading to touch the charged air. Electricity danced between my fingertips, not painful, but ecstatic, like every nerve was firing with pure information. The sensor array was screaming data into the satellite feed, electromagnetic readings off the scale, gravitational anomalies that shouldn't exist, temperature fluctuations that defied thermodynamics, all of it streaming live to servers worldwide, impossible to suppress or delete simultaneously. Through the golden haze I saw them, spheres of light moving through the forest. Not aircraft, not drones, perfect orbs of luminescence following the ley line like trains on invisible tracks. They moved silently, purposefully, some the size of basketballs, others as large as cars. One passed directly over me, and for a moment I felt connected to something vast, a network of energy that wrapped the planet like neural pathways. The revelation hit me all at once. The ley lines weren't just electromagnetic corridors, they were conscious. Not alive exactly, but aware. The Earth itself was a single vast organism, and these lines were its sensory network, its method of experiencing and responding to everything on its surface. The ancient builders hadn't just discovered the grid, they'd communicated with it. Their monuments were interface points, allowing human consciousness to merge temporarily with planetary awareness. That's why sacred sites induced religious experiences. That's why people felt transformed at these locations. And now, modern civilization was damaging this network. Every skyscraper driven deep into the earth, every mine boring through the corridors, every electromagnetic broadcast interfering with the natural frequencies, we were giving the planet the equivalent of nerve damage. The surge peaked at 6:13 p.m, lasting exactly 26 minutes. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The lights vanished. The stone went dark. My equipment powered down simultaneously, despite having hours of battery remaining. In the sudden silence, I heard vehicles approaching. Many vehicles. I grabbed the memory cards from the recording equipment and ran. Behind me, floodlights blazed to life, turning the grove into harsh daylight. Voices shouted in multiple languages. A helicopter thundered overhead, its searchlights sweeping through the trees. But I'd prepared for this. My real van was hidden 2 kilometers away. The one by the grove was a decoy, purchased for this specific purpose. While they surrounded it, I was already driving down back roads toward a safe house I'd arranged weeks earlier. The data had uploaded successfully. 87 gigabytes of impossible readings that proved the Earth's energy grid was real, measurable, and more powerful than anyone imagined. Within hours, it would be mirrored on servers worldwide, impossible to suppress completely. But as I drove through the darkness, one thought haunted me. If the grid was conscious, if the Earth itself was aware, what did it think of what we were doing to it? And more terrifyingly, how long before it decided to stop tolerating us? The safe house was a converted barn in the Pyrenees, owned by a conspiracy theorist named Marcus, who'd contacted me through encrypted channels after my data went live. He believed the government was controlling weather through chemtrails, which was absurd, but he also had solar panels, satellite internet, and absolutely no trust in authority. Exactly what I needed. For 3 days, I watched my findings ripple across the internet. Alternative news sites ran with headlines like, "Proof Earth's secret energy grid exposed." Scientists on Twitter debated the data's authenticity. Skeptics called it an elaborate hoax, but enough people with credentials were taking it seriously that mainstream media couldn't ignore it entirely. Then Marcus knocked on my door at dawn on the 4th day. "You have a visitor, says you're expecting him." I wasn't expecting anyone. The man standing in Marcus's kitchen looked like a university professor from the 1970s. Corduroy jacket with elbow patches, wild grey hair, thick glasses repaired with tape. He was drinking tea from a chipped mug and studying my printed data with intense focus. "Mr. Morrison," he said without looking up, "my name is Professor Emanuel Richter. I'm the one who sent you the sensor blueprints." The anonymous contact. I studied him carefully. "How did you find me?" "The same way they'll find you eventually, the satellite uplink signature. But I know how to mask my movements. 30 years of practice." He finally looked at me, his eyes sharp behind the thick lenses. "Your data is magnificent, but you're missing the larger picture." "Enlighten me!" He pulled out a battered laptop and opened a file filled with equations I couldn't begin to understand. "The ley lines aren't just electromagnetic. That's merely the aspect we can measure with current technology. They're multi-dimensional conduits, channels through space-time itself. That's impossible. So is your gravitational anomaly data, yet there it is." He pulled up a world map covered in glowing lines. Every ancient culture had different names for it. Chi in China, Prana in India, Pneuma in Greece. They were all describing the same phenomenon, a fundamental force that mainstream physics hasn't acknowledged. Why hasn't physics acknowledged it? Richter laughed bitterly. Because those who discover it either join the suppression or disappear. I was part of the suppression for 20 years. He told me his story. In 1973, fresh from MIT with a PhD in theoretical physics, he'd been recruited by a Defense Department think tank. His job, investigate anomalous energy readings at ancient sites worldwide. Within 2 years, his team had mapped the basic structure of the Earth grid and realized its potential. Unlimited clean energy, he said. Instantaneous communication across any distance. Even manipulation of localized space-time. The military applications were obvious, but so were the benefits for humanity. We could have transformed civilization. What happened? We succeeded. His face darkened. The first experimental tap into a ley line intersection was in Nevada, 1978. We pulled enough energy in 30 seconds to power Las Vegas for a year. Then the intersection point destabilized. He showed me a classified photo, a perfectly circular crater 300 meters across, the sand turned to glass. The official record lists it as an underground nuclear test, but no bomb did that. We'd ruptured something fundamental in the grid structure. The project was immediately classified beyond top secret. Research continued, but focused on weaponization rather than energy production. HARP, Richter explained, wasn't about weather modification or mind control, those were cover stories. It was about learning to manipulate the grid without destabilizing it. But they're failing, he continued. Every year more intersection points become unstable. The Haiti earthquake, the Japanese tsunami, the increase in volcanic activity, they're all symptoms of grid breakdown. Caused by what? Everything. Mining operations cutting through ley lines, fracking disrupting deep conduits, cities spreading concrete over intersection points. But the worst damage comes from electromagnetic pollution, cellular towers, Wi-Fi, satellite transmissions. We're drowning out the Earth's natural frequency. He pulled up another image, a graph showing electromagnetic background radiation over time. It had increased 10,000-fold since 1900. The ancients understood balance, Richter said. Their monuments weren't just markers, they were regulators. Stone circles amplified and stabilized the energy. Pyramids acted as capacitors, storing excess power. Temple complexes provided controlled release points. It was a planetary management system maintained for thousands of years. Until we forgot, until we were made to forget. His expression hardened. The knowledge was deliberately suppressed, first by religions that wanted monopolies on spiritual experience, then by governments that wanted monopolies on power, now by corporations that profit from scarcity. A car engine growled outside. Marcus appeared in the doorway, shotgun in hand. 3 black SUVs coming up the mountain road. Richter stood calmly. They tracked me, not you. I've been sloppy, getting old, I suppose. He handed me a flash drive. Everything I couldn't publish, 40 years of research, the complete grid map, the frequency specifications, the names of everyone involved in the cover-up. Come with me, I said. We can both run. I'm 73 years old, Mr. Morrison. I've been running since 1991. He smiled sadly. But information wants to be free. Upload that data everywhere. Send it to journalists, scientists, anyone who'll listen. Make it impossible to suppress. The vehicles were getting closer. Marcus was already at his truck, engine running. Richter walked to the door, then turned back. One more thing. The grid isn't just breaking down, it's evolving. The electromagnetic pollution we're producing is forcing it to adapt, to develop new pathways. The lights you saw at Karnak, they're increasing worldwide. The grid is trying to heal itself, but if we don't stop interfering, he shook his head, the Earth will protect itself, even if that means eliminating the infection. We're the infection? From the planet's perspective? Yes. He walked out to meet the SUVs. I ran to Marcus's truck and we tore down the back road as fast as the ancient vehicle could manage. In the mirrors, I saw men in tactical gear surrounding the farmhouse. Richter stood in the doorway, hands raised, dignity intact, even in surrender. We drove for 6 hours, changing vehicles twice, before I felt safe enough to stop. In a roadside motel that still used actual keys, I opened Richter's flash drive. The data was staggering. Detailed maps of every ley line intersection on Earth. Energy readings from 6 decades of secret monitoring. Photos of ancient sites I'd never heard of, all showing the same telltale signs of grid integration. And a list of names. Politicians, CEOs, military leaders, all aware of the grid's existence, all complicit in hiding it. But most importantly, there were the repair protocols. Richter's team had developed methods to stabilize damaged intersection points, to restore the grid's natural balance, the knowledge to undo decades of damage, the blueprints for saving the planet's nervous system. The cafe in Prague is busy enough that I blend in, anonymous among the tourists and students. My laptop is connected through 7 proxy servers, my identity masked by layers of encryption that would make the NSA proud. The barista brings my 3rd espresso of the morning. and I nod my thanks without looking up from the screen. The world has changed since Karnak. Not visibly. The same traffic jams clog the streets, the same politicians make the same promises, the same corporations chase the same profits. But underneath, in the invisible currents that connect all things, something fundamental has shifted. Richter's data didn't just expose the conspiracy, it provided a roadmap for resistance. The first wave of releases came through WikiLeaks, the Panama Papers network, and a dozen smaller journalism outlets simultaneously. By the time the suppression teams realised the scope of the leak, copies were already spreading across the dark web faster than they could be eliminated. The names, the cover-up, the military applications, all of it laid bare for anyone willing to look. The mainstream media tried to ignore it at first, then dismissed it as fringe pseudoscience. But when MIT physicists began replicating the sensor readings, when archaeological teams started confirming the monument alignments, when seismologists noticed the correlation between grid disruption and earthquake patterns, denial became impossible. The second wave was more practical. Anonymous networks of researchers, hackers and activists began building Richter's stabilization devices. The components were surprisingly accessible. Copper coils, quartz crystals, simple electronics. Within months, guerrilla grid repair operations were springing up worldwide. They called themselves the Earth Guardians, though the media branded them eco-terrorists after the first infrastructure disruption. A cellular tower in California went offline for 3 days when activists installed a resonance dampener at its base. A fracking operation in Pennsylvania was forced to shut down when mysterious equipment failures plagued their site. The authorities couldn't understand how protesters were disabling billion-dollar installations with what looked like art projects. They still don't understand that they're not fighting the technology, they're working with it. The grid wants to heal itself, we're just helping it remember how. The third wave is happening now, and it's the most dangerous one yet, because the Earth is starting to respond. I click through the news feeds on my encrypted browser. A magnitude 6.2 earthquake in Nevada, precisely centred on a classified military facility. The official story blames shifting tectonic plates, but satellite images show the epicenter as a perfect circle exactly 300 metres across, the same dimensions as Richter's 1978 crater. The Earth is healing that old wound, and anything built on top of it is simply relocated. Similar natural disasters are occurring worldwide. A mysterious sinkhole swallowed a Chinese mining operation that was drilling through a major ley line. The Large Hadron Collider experienced a catastrophic failure that physicists can't explain. Every component simply stopped working simultaneously, as if the Earth itself had withdrawn permission for the experiment. The most telling incidents are the recoveries. Ancient sites that had been disrupted by modern construction are spontaneously healing. The stones of Avebury, displaced by roads and buildings, have begun generating electromagnetic fields so powerful that nearby electronic equipment fails. The original Nazca lines in Peru are glowing again, visible from space without infrared enhancement. Reports of luminous phenomena are increasing exponentially. The same spheres of light I witnessed at Karnak are now appearing at intersection points across the globe. The scientific community calls them ball lightning or atmospheric plasma events, but those of us who know the truth understand what we're seeing. The Earth's immune system activating, my encrypted messenger pings, the new report from our monitoring station in Scotland. Roslyn Chapel energy spike recorded at 14:47 GMT. Visual confirmation of grid activation. Stone began resonating at 7.83 Hz for approximately 30 minutes. Local electronics disrupted in 2-kilometre radius. Phenomenon spreading along ley line toward Edinburgh. Estimate arrival in 6 hours. 7.83 Hz. The Schumann resonance, the Earth's natural frequency. The planet is remembering how to sing. I close the laptop and step outside. Prague sprawls before me, a modern city built atop ancient foundations, and I can feel the tension beneath its streets. 3 major ley lines converge under Wenceslas Square, their intersection buried under centuries of construction. The grid flows around the obstruction now, like water around a stone, but the pressure is building. Soon, the Earth will decide whether to accommodate our cities or reclaim its sacred geometry. And honestly, after seeing what we've done to the planet's nervous system, I'm not sure I'd blame it for choosing reclamation. My phone buzzes, a text from an unknown number. Café Louvre, corner table, 5 minutes. I almost ignore it. Anonymous contacts have led to both salvation and near capture over the past 6 months. But something about the message feels different, urgent without being threatening. The Café Louvre is just around the corner, a historic establishment that once hosted Einstein and Kafka. I find the corner table occupied by a woman in her 50s, professionally dressed but with the weathered hands of someone who works outdoors. Her eyes are the pale blue of winter sky. It takes me a moment to recognise her without the wool shawl. The old woman from Holubis, the one who warned me to stop digging. She looks younger somehow, more vibrant, as if the past months have restored something vital that had been missing. "Sit," she says in accented English. "We have much to discuss and little time." I remain standing. "Who are you?" "My name is Dr. Vera Novakova." I was Professor Richter's research partner from 1975 to 1991. When the project went dark, I returned to Prague and spent 30 years watching the grid deteriorate, watching the old ways die. She gestures to the empty chair. "Please, the Earth Guardians need guidance from someone who understands the ancient protocols." Slowly I sit. "You've been monitoring us?" "Protecting you. The network Marcus connected you to. Half of those encrypted channels run through servers I maintain. The financial accounts that kept you hidden, funded by a trust I established decades ago. Did you think your escape from Karnak was purely your own skill?" The revelation hits like cold water. "You've been manipulating everything. Facilitating. There's a difference." She pulls out a tablet showing a world map covered in pulsing nodes of light. "The grid is awakening faster than we anticipated. Your data release accelerated the process. What should have taken decades is happening in months." "That's good, isn't it? The Earth healing itself?" Her expression darkens. "Healing, yes, but healing can be traumatic. When a broken bone resets itself, the process is violent. The grid is preparing to realign the planet's energy flows, and everything built in opposition to those flows will be swept aside." She zooms in on major cities, each one sitting atop intersection points like tumours on nerve endings. New York, London, Tokyo, they're all going to be tested. The grid will offer them a choice, adapt or be removed. Most will choose to fight rather than change. So we warn them, show them the repair protocols. Do you really think the forces that suppressed this knowledge for 70 years will suddenly embrace it? That governments and corporations will voluntarily dismantle the systems that gave them power? She shakes her head. They'll try to weaponize the awakening instead, turn the Earth's own defense mechanisms against their enemies. The chill runs through me as I understand the implications. They'll try to control the grid. They're already trying. HARP has been broadcasting disruption frequencies for weeks. The Chinese are using their rare Earth mining operations to physically sever ley lines. The Russians are detonating nuclear devices at intersection points, trying to create artificial nodes they can control. The tablet shows the results. Chaotic feedback loops spreading across the planet's energy network like infection. Every intervention makes the situation worse. They're not just damaging individual lines anymore, they're destabilizing the entire system. What happens if the grid fails completely? Dr. Novakova closes the tablet. According to our models, the planet's magnetic field becomes erratic, weather patterns collapse, tectonic stability fails, the biosphere begins to shut down. She meets my eyes. Extinction event, not just for humans, for everything. The weight of it settles over me like a shroud. We're not just fighting for disclosure anymore, or even for environmental protection. We're fighting for the continuation of life on Earth. So what do we do? She slides a memory chip across the table. The complete archive. Every site, every frequency, every ancient protocol we've recovered. But also something new. Integration codes. Integration codes? The monuments were just the beginning. The ancients didn't just build regulatory structures, they created organic interfaces. Humans who could merge temporarily with the grid consciousness, becoming living nodes in the network. The genetic markers still exist in certain bloodlines. My hand freezes halfway to the memory chip. You're talking about human sacrifice. Not sacrifice. Symbiosis. Her voice carries a strange resonance, as if speaking from great depth. The planet needs conscious partners, not just passive regulators. People willing to become part of the grid itself to help guide the awakening. And you think I'm one of these bloodlines? I know you are. The way you responded to the energy at Karnak, the ease with which you detected the grid patterns, these aren't learned skills, Mr. Morrison. They're genetic memories. She stands, leaving the chip on the table. The network is ready to make you an offer. Full integration. Consciousness expanded beyond individual awareness. Partnership in planetary stewardship. In exchange for what? Your human life. Your individual existence. You would become something larger, but you would cease to be Alex Morrison. The cafe continues around us, conversations in Czech and English. The hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of cups on saucers. Normal life proceeding as if we weren't discussing the potential end of human civilization. How long do I have to decide? The awakening reaches critical phase at the next solar maximum, 18 months. After that, the grid will make its own decisions about humanity's future, with or without conscious human partners. She walks away, pausing at the door. The old woman who warned you at Holubis. She made the integration choice in 1968, during the Prague Spring. The Soviets thought they were suppressing political uprising, but they were really trying to prevent grid awakening. She's been guiding the network ever since, preserving the knowledge until the right time. And you? Dr. Novakova smiles, and for a moment her eyes glow with the same blue light I'd seen in the copper coils. I made my choice years ago. Everything I've done since has been the grid working through me, including finding you. She steps into the Prague afternoon and vanishes into the crowd. I sit alone with the memory chip, feeling the weight of impossible decision. Save the planet by joining it. Preserve humanity by transcending it. Outside, storm clouds are gathering despite the morning's clear forecast. Through the cafe window I can see electrical discharges dancing between the cloud layers. Not lightning, but something more purposeful. The grid flexing its muscles, testing its strength. My laptop chimes with incoming messages from Earth Guardian cells worldwide. Similar phenomena are being reported from every continent. The awakening is accelerating. I slip the memory chip into my pocket and pay for my coffee. Whatever choice I make, it won't be here in this cafe, surrounded by the comfortable illusions of normal life. It will be at an intersection point, where the planet's consciousness runs closest to the surface, where human and Earth awareness can touch. The old town square of Prague is a 15-minute walk, built over one of the most powerful convergence points in Europe. As I step into the street, I can already feel it calling, a deep thrumming beneath the cobblestones, a magnetic pull that bypasses rational thought and speaks directly to something ancestral in my cells. Time to find out what I really am and what I might become. This message was uploaded simultaneously to 12,847 servers worldwide at 11:47 GMT on March 21st, the spring equinox. Source analysis indicates the transmission originated from Prague, Czech Republic, but routing through quantum encrypted channels makes precise location impossible. To anyone receiving this, my name was Alex Morrison, and this is my final report. I'm writing this from the Old Town Square in Prague, sitting on the steps of the astronomical clock. It's just past midnight, and the square is empty except for me and the growing sphere of blue light that hovers above the central flagstones. The light is beautiful. Not harsh like electric illumination, but soft and deep, like looking into the heart of a star. I can feel it calling to me. The memory chip Dr. Novakova gave me contained everything she promised, and more. The complete archive of human grid interactions spanning 5,000 years, bloodline genealogies tracing back to the monument builders, and the integration protocols, step-by-step instructions for conscious merger with planetary consciousness. I've spent the past 3 hours uploading everything to dead drops and secure servers across the globe. By the time anyone reads this, the information will be replicated beyond any possibility of suppression. The grid won't die with me, but more importantly, I've realised that choice was an illusion. The integration isn't something I can accept or refuse. It's already happening. It has been happening since that first moment in Holubix, when my equipment failed and I felt something vast and patient taking notice of me. Every breakthrough, every narrow escape, every perfectly timed contact, none of it was luck or skill. The grid has been slowly incorporating me into itself, preparing me for this moment. The Alex Morrison who started this journey no longer exists. What remains is something between human and other, a bridge between two forms of consciousness. The sphere is descending now, close enough that I can see patterns moving within its light, mathematical forms that hurt to look at directly, but speak to parts of my brain that shouldn't exist. I understand now why the ancients built their monuments with such precision. They weren't following blueprints, they were translating visions like this one into stone and earth. Around the world, others are receiving similar calls. The bloodlines are awakening. Not many, perhaps a few thousand individuals scattered across the planet, but enough. Enough to serve as living nodes in the network, enough to help guide the transformation. Because that's what this is. Not an ending, but a metamorphosis. The environmental crisis, the grid breakdown, the increasing natural disasters, they're birth pangs. The Earth is evolving into something new, something that can consciously participate in cosmic processes instead of simply enduring them. But evolution requires cooperation, and cooperation requires communication. That's where we come in, the bridges, the translators. I can feel my individual thoughts beginning to merge with something infinitely larger. Not lost, expanded. Like a drop of water finally understanding that it was always part of the ocean. The fear is gone now, replaced by wonder at the sheer scope of what I'm becoming part of. The sphere touches my forehead, and suddenly I can perceive the entire planet as a single living system. Every heartbeat, every breath, every growing plant and moving animal connected by streams of light that pulse in perfect rhythm. The ley lines aren't empty channels. They're full of consciousness, carrying the thoughts and dreams and experiences of everything that has ever lived on Earth. And beyond Earth, other networks stretch across the galaxy. Planetary minds in conversation across impossible distances, sharing the wisdom gained from billions of years of conscious evolution. We're not alone. We never were. We just weren't developed enough to hear the conversation. Until now, the transformation is accelerating. I can feel other nodes coming online. In the Amazon rainforest, where an indigenous shaman stepped into a similar sphere of light. At Uluru, where an Aboriginal elder touched the songlines and felt them sing back. At Glastonbury Tor, where a British physicist finally understood why his equations had been leading him there. We are becoming the Earth's nervous system, its immune system, its consciousness. The governments and corporations will try to fight this change, of course. They'll use their weapons and their machines and their desperate attempts to control forces they can't comprehend. But they're fighting the planet itself now, and planets are patient in ways that human institutions cannot imagine. Some cities will fall, some systems will collapse, but from the wreckage something better will grow. A civilization in harmony with its living world instead of at war with it. The survivors will learn to listen to the Earth's voice, to build with the grid instead of against it, to see themselves as part of a larger organism instead of its masters. It won't be easy, evolution never is, but it will be beautiful. The light is surrounding me completely now. I can barely remember being separate from it. Soon this human form will dissolve, and what was Alex Morrison will become part of something vast and interconnected and eternal. But first, one final message for anyone who finds this record. The grid is not our enemy. It never was. It's our mother, our teacher, our future. Those of you who can feel its call, don't resist. Step into the light. Become part of the solution. Those who can't or won't, please step aside. The Earth is healing itself, and it will not be stopped by fear or greed, or the desperate clinging to systems that no longer serve. The age of separation is ending. The age of integration has begun. Welcome to the awakening.